we're going to start with this picture of a lawn. This was my neighbor's lawn when I was in school for landscape architecture. I lived at a house with a bunch of people in the Lincoln Park Historic District in Pomona. Kind of very traditional aesthetic at the time. It started to change quite a bit, but this was Bob's lawn, and Bob spent a lot of time on his lawn and was very patient with us when we started to rip out ours. And we are going to start with great reasons to have a lawn. Because I'm not here to tell you that you need to rip out all of your lawn to be a good person. There are some things that a lawn is good for. A lawn is a great place for kids to play. A more naturalistic garden is also a great place for kids to play, but maybe you want both, kids learning to walk and falling down. The lawn is a pretty good place for that sort of stuff. Lawns are nice to lay in every once in a while. However, you can also think about a more like naturalistic meadow, which can also be a great place to lay in. Lawns, the way most people end up dealing with lawns, at least here in suburban Southern California, is actually pretty easy. You don't need to think that much about it, especially if you have a gardener. I mean, that's just the reality. Lawns, in theory, might be high maintenance, but the way most people in Southern California take care of a lawn is they put a check in the mailbox once a month and don't think about it, and the gardener takes care of it. It might not look great, but people who are very busy, generally don't need to think too much about it. And if it's a neatly kept lawn, even if it's not gorgeous, the neighbors generally won't complain. So for a long time, it's been default just because it's kind of simple and people don't need to think about it. But if you don't use your lawn, if you don't have kids or grandkids learning to walk on it or using it for soccer practice, or if you don't use all of your lawn, lawns are boring and they don't do much for most of us. There's just not much going on there. And there are so many different things we can do in that precious space that we get to make decisions about, which is often larger than the inside part of our house. Why wouldn't we want something that's more interesting, more reflective of what we want to see, and more useful for us all at the same time while saving water? They're both boring aesthetically and how we use them, but they are also ecologically boring. Lawns essentially are ecological or environmental disaster areas. They provide very little habitat for local birds, butterflies, pollinators, all sorts of things that really need our help, both because some species are in trouble from habitat loss, but even the species that you don't hear about, like being endangered or threatened as a species, over the last number of decades, the population numbers of a lot of those species has plummeted. Maybe not to that level yet, but the habitat is just really going away, has been going away for decades. And we can actually build some functional habitat wherever you are, whatever your local ecosystem type is, in our areas that are currently lawn. And they can be more beautiful and more interesting while we do that. We can have all of that. And in addition to that, especially if you are working with either native plants to where you are, or like, for example, in Southern California, working with Mediterranean plants or plants from similar Mediterranean climates, we also get to completely get away from needing pesticides and fertilizers, which is amazing. It's less work to do, less expense, and way better for the environment. So we can move away from that. Runoff from lawns, both due to pesticides, but especially due to fertilizers, are major sources of local water pollution in our creeks and streams. So even if it seems like you're in an urban area, for example, where I am, eventually the stormwater runoff ends up in a wetland area farther down in the watershed and called Prado Basin. And that large area is home to a number of endangered species. And so if there is pollution running off of our lawns in storm events, it's going to end up down there. Whereas with a more ecologically focused landscape, whatever the aesthetic is, the water that runs, for example, off your roof or off your driveway, some of it can sink in, which is great, but anything that leaves can generally be cleaner by the time it gets down there instead of being more polluted. Lawns use lots of water. For most of the people in this workshop today, and definitely for our local area, that is a huge thing. Getting rid of a well-watered lawn and putting in a native or locally adapted garden generally will use a quarter of the water or less. And if you really want to focus your plant choices on making it less than that, you can. And then finally, lawns actually in the US kind of originated as an attempt to look like a rich European landowner on the property. That's essentially where the lawn aesthetic comes from. Lawns as turf developed among the aristocracy in Europe and essentially were there kind of showing off that they had so much space that they didn't need to use it for anything productive. It could just be flat and green, this abstract expanse. And I would much rather have a lower input, less work, much more beautiful landscape filled with birds and butterflies using our California native plants than doing a whole bunch of work in a attempt to look like a small scale rich European landowner. So reasons to get rid of the lawn. So think, how much lawn do you actually want to use? And a lot of people these days they've already kind of made the leap. They're ready to get rid of lawn. The question is, what do we do instead? So the simplest answer to that, I'll take from Mike Evans, who is one of the owners of Tree of Life Nursery, great, mostly California native plant nursery in San Juan Capistrano, who is constantly reminding us that ugly is not a turf replacement. So what's going to come afterwards should have all of these benefits. The kinds of landscapes that we're talking about absolutely do not need to be wall-to-wall gravel and just a couple of cactuses. And in fact, we want multiple levels of plants, even if you're out there in the true desert, some desert trees, some colorful desert shrubs. I mean, these beautiful places, even in the true desert, which we are not in my part of Southern California, but even in the true desert, if you go to the most gorgeous places to see the beautiful spring flowers, there are cacti, but there's also lots of beautiful flowering shrubs. The most comfortable places to be have some desert trees, so you can mix all of that in. And locally, once you get down to kind of Inland Empire area where we are, there are so many different ecosystem types. So we're just going to look at some inspiration now. If you really want to get into the design stuff, I'm going to mention some of our other workshops that we either have coming up or we have past recordings on our YouTube page. We have the number one place to go for kind of a more well-rounded introduction would be our landscape transformation basics class, which I will actually be teaching this coming Thursday evening from 6 to 8:30 live here on Zoom. But we also have past recordings available now where we'll talk more about project planning, more about design. And I would also really encourage you to check out either our do-it-yourself landscape design class or our California native garden design class to really get more into that. So we're just going to look at some brief inspiration before we get kind of down to the nitty-gritty about turf identification, weed identification, removal techniques, and how to kind of formulate your plot to get rid of your lawn. So here are some of my favorite plants for Southern California native landscapes. And most of these plants and landscapes, we're talking once they've been in the ground for a year or two, a deep watering once a month. So more water applied at a single time than you would apply to like each time you water your lawn 3 times a week, because in that case, you're only doing a few inches because the lawn doesn't have deep roots, but overall way, way less water. And in the months that it rains or in the cooler months, maybe even less than that. So can be very naturalistic, can be very modern, can be more traditional, can be a mix of kind of like modern lines with allowing for a wilder aesthetic, or kind of a native version of a cottage garden. There are so many different ways you can go with it aesthetically and different forms it can take, all of which are much more interesting and end up, especially once some trees grow in, become much more habitable spaces. Can do very interesting things like getting rid of way too much pavement and making things feel more like patio spaces if there's a large enough budget and if you want to get creative with it. And just can be very, very welcoming places. I mean, walking down the sections of this oak line street in Pasadena in summer, a lot of places still have lawn. This is a really, really low maintenance combination of succulents and native plants front yard landscape. Just feels so much nicer than even just green lawns out in reflected heat. These landscapes can feel sheltering and just great places to be. If you prefer more traditional aesthetic, you can still accomplish that as well. So this patch of green here is a turf alternative. It's a native plant yarrow, which is grown in a large enough clump that it can look kind of like a lawn for people who still want that green expanse. You're going to be watering that yarrow more than once a month, but twice a month is pretty viable for most of Southern California in the summer, and then way less. Maybe a few splashes more, but definitely way less water than traditional lawn. And if you want to let it flower, beautiful, kind of covered in white flowers in the late spring, early summer. Or maybe going with the kind of more meadowy effect. So we're not going to spend too much time on design today. We have lots of other classes for that. Today is where we can really get practical with the mechanics of removing your turf, doing your best to make sure it's not going to come back and start competing with your new landscape. Because the challenging thing about turf is in a hot, dry climate, when you want it to grow and be nice and even and green, it seems like it just wants to die. But for most of our lawns, with the mix of turf types that we have, once you decide, okay, I just want it all to die, enough of it wants to keep coming back that it will also cause us headaches, especially if we don't do a really thorough job, really making sure that turf is dead before our new plantings go in. So for today's outline, we're going to learn about the turf types and weeds that should be on your radar. Then we're going to spend the bulk of it going through turf removal methods, how-tos, the advantages and disadvantages and applications of each of those methods, where you might even combine some of those methods. Then we'll talk about what to expect next and kind of first steps for beginning to plan from there. Somewhere in there, we'll take a break. Quick note about how to interact with me as we are going through this. I encourage you to ask questions. What we find works best for our webinars is we're not actually going to have people like raise hands and then have them talk, because we find that there's a lot of downtime with people's audio, things like that. So the best thing to do is to use the Q&A function. So you will see in your Zoom interface a button you can press with a couple of little chat bubbles that says Q&A. So feel free to type in questions at any time as we go. And I have that window open off screen and kind of am keeping an eye on it. So I'll see when questions start to come in and amass. And then in between sections, at good points to stop, I will catch up on all of the recent questions. What we find works best is as I stop for the flow of the presentation, as I stop between sections, I'm going to answer the questions that really mostly pertain to the topic that we've been talking about. If you have questions that are more like, I have this specific situation at home, what do you suggest I do about it? I'm happy to spend time answering those questions, but I might need to hold some of those until the end so we can make sure we get through the content. And then if I need to stay later than noon to answer all of those more individual questions, I will do that. No problem at all. Happy to help, but I might need to hold some of those kind of towards the end. For those of you who recently joined, we had a question come in. Will we be able to download the handout so we can print pictures, etc.? Yeah, so I will type into the chat, which is another function. So there's the Q&A, and then there's the button for chat. And I will type in the couple of relevant links. Immediately after this presentation, I'm going to save this whole presentation out as a single PDF file. And you will be able to download it at cbwcd.org/presentations. I just went to the chat. And so that's just literally, it's a list of links from all of our past presentations in chronological order. So this one will be at the top as soon as I get that up. And it's going to be a pretty large file. Usually by the time we save out the PDF, it's like 80 something megabytes or so. So the best thing to do is to try to right click and do save linked file as. If for some reason your browser loads the whole thing, just give it a few minutes, let the whole thing load, and then you can do save as. So that will be there. And then we are also recording this. And by sometime midweek next week, after some light editing of kind of the downtime at the beginning and the end and the break, it will be posted at cbwcd.org/YouTube, which will bring you right there. Currently, right away, there is a past version of when I taught this topic already up there. So that's how you can get that information if you want to refer back to it. And there will definitely be some things that will be, especially when we get into grass types and pictures of different grass types, will be useful to refer back to. So here we go. If you take one thing from this workshop, if you are removing a lawn to put in a different type of garden afterwards, you really, really want to put in the effort to completely kill your lawn to the extent possible. We're going to talk a lot about what things look like when they're dormant, which some species can do, and it will look dead, but it's not. And as soon as it gets the water and some summer or spring heat and the right conditions, it's going to come back, and it's going to come back strong. And so what a lot of people do is they will plant thinking their lawn is dead. And then even though they're putting in water-wise plants, the first year in Southern California, you're usually watering even your California native plants a good deep watering once a week to help them get rooted out and established before you really cut back that water. Still going to be watering way less than a lawn that first year, but that water is enough to really bring back a lot of the turf types, not as a beautiful even turf, but really enough to cause you problems. And once those old grasses, their roots are all intermixed with your new plants, it's really so much more work to stay on top of it than if you put that extra effort in the first place to do a thorough job of killing your lawn to the extent possible. In most cases, there will still be a little bit that grows back afterwards. That's just the reality. But the goal is for it to be a small enough amount that it's not a very difficult weeding job. It's just kind of part of your normal, occasional garden maintenance, like other weeds might come up, rather than really being something that you are having to spend a lot of time managing it. And I have seen plenty of gardens that by the third year it's in the ground, it's just a tangled mess of especially the Bermuda grass that's trying to grow back. So all of this is really focused on helping you do the most thorough job to completely kill your lawn. We are going into the best season, kind of the late spring to early summer is the best season in Southern California to kill turf. And so your kind of strategy, if you're just starting to think about this now, it's probably going to be to start thinking about design, but then be actually killing your turf late spring into the summer, preparing for a fall planting once the weather starts to cool off, kind of like right before Thanksgiving. Because it takes a while, and we'll talk about that timeline. And you want to know your grass and your weeds. And this is super important because some grasses are much harder to kill than others. When in doubt, in Southern California, just assume that you have some Bermuda grass in your lawn, and you're going to need to deal with it because most people do. But here's kind of the thorough examination. You don't need to know the specific species. You don't need to become a botanist. We're going to talk about the major turf types. First one we're going to talk about is tall fescue grass. This is what's called a cool season grass. It's green and growing all year long. It takes the most water. It is kind of the typical lawn for projects that go in because it is the kind of most lush looking, darkest, most even green. And it's one that with adequate moisture is not going to turn brown or tan at all in the winter in Southern California. So like one of the most common trade names are the Marathon, whether it's seed or sod. There's a number of other ones as well. Some of them claim to be low water, but I mean, that's really like they're slightly lower water than the highest water tall fescue. They're all high water, especially in Southern California. And that's the case. If you have beautiful, cool season turf, or even if it's like a little patchy with some brown spots because of the irrigation system, that is kind of the ideal for killing turf because it is the one that really, really, really doesn't want to live in hot, dry areas. And this is the one kind of turf that you almost can completely kill by just turning the water off for a long enough time and then watering again to make sure that it's totally dead. And it would be in many cases. Or when it comes to the turf removal part, this one doesn't come back kind of like with a vengeance or anything. However, even if you started with tall fescue, even if sometime when you were living at your current property, you had beautiful tall fescue sod put in, the reality is that most of us have between some and significant amounts of Bermuda grass in our lawns, no matter what we started out with. And so we're going to cover both common Bermuda grass as well as hybrid Bermuda grass together. So hybrid Bermuda grass is sometimes put in by people really looking to have a lawn and both conserve the most water. It's also one that's used at golf courses because you can cut it really, really low. The hybrid Bermudas tend to be kind of high maintenance, although they take less water. But what most of us have is common weedy Bermuda grass, which at some point in time seed blew in and it's taken over significant amounts of our lawn. No matter what you start with, especially if you have a garden service, those lawnmowers and string trimmers are going all around town, picking up all of the seeds in all of the lawns that they mow and transmitting those seeds to other lawns. And so if you have in the coldest parts of winter, a pretty green lawn, and then there's some patches that turn brown unexplainably, even in the cool, wet time of the year, with no matter like, even if it's not like a fertilization issue, that's because that part is Bermuda grass usually. It's going to be a finer, kind of stringier grass. If you look at it up close, it has these kind of short stems and short leaves. And Bermuda grass can go dormant. It goes dormant in the coldest parts of winter. So you can see in the lower right, that is what it looks like if there was a whole entire Bermuda grass lawn. Again, normally in Southern California, it's kind of patches that look like this. And if you look closely, it's that kind of stringy, close to the ground, small leaves. And then over time, it can get taller. This is kind of what happens when Bermuda grass stops getting mowed, and you can see how it grows over the edges. If there is a yard like this in your neighborhood, this will be producing enough seeds and blowing all over the place that you will probably have Bermuda grass in your lawn. In my neighborhood, in the cul-de-sac where I live, lawns get mowed, but Bermuda grass can go to seed so quickly in the summer that I always have a little bit of it coming back in my garden, and it's just part of my normal weeding. That might be the case, and that's just kind of what to expect. Water-wise gardens can be low maintenance, but none of them are no maintenance. So a little bit of weeding, especially if you have something like this in your neighborhood, is just to be expected. St. Augustine grass is another not super common. It's more kind of common in some public spaces, but you very well might have it. Generally, It's installed with an intention. It's great in shadier areas. If it has shade from trees, St. Augustine does really well. It also requires significantly less water than the tall fescue grass, and it will go brown as well in the coldest parts of the winter. It is a warm season grass. It is aggressive. It's not quite as hard to take care of and get rid of as Bermuda grass, but it does take quite a bit of work, and it can form a very thick thatch as well, which might take some work kind of digging through if you are removing it. And then also around, sometimes considered a weed, occasionally intentionally installed as a lawn because it does take less water than a tall fescue, is kikuyu grass, which is also, you can see it looks different, but in terms of how you would deal with it, pretty similar to St. Augustine and Bermuda. So just to review, we have tall fescue, we have our Bermuda, we have St. Augustine, and we have kikuyu. And really, in terms of techniques, how it splits out is tall fescue is going to be the easiest, and then all these other lumped together, although Bermuda is the toughest, most resilient. If you want some cues for identifying what type you have, seed heads, if things have gone to seed or if it's going to happen in the season before you start taking out your lawn, are very useful. In the late spring through summer, if it's not mowed for even a couple of weeks, Bermuda grass will start to go to seed, and those kind of like I call them like starburst patterns, but there's a center and then kind of a hub with these seed heads coming out. That's very distinctive of Bermuda grass. So you might recognize that as something that you get in your yard seasonally. Tall fescue needs to get quite tall before it goes to seed. So you don't often see that in like the suburban lawn. And then for Bermuda, here's some other identifiers. And so if you see it coming up like in mulch, just these little still kind of pale rhizomes, here's kind of what it looks like. Not kind of a little tall, but not totally out of control. And then the seed heads, the stems which creep along the top of the ground and reroot, called stolons, and then the rhizomes which creep as well. And so one of the reasons why Bermuda grass can be so hard to deal with, also a reason why you never, ever, ever want to run a rototiller over an area where you're trying to get rid of Bermuda grass, is because Bermuda grass can regrow from seed. It can regrow from stolons. So if this was ground up, each one of these individual rooted parts of the stem can become their own plant. And the same thing for the rhizomes that creep and reroot. That's how it can spread so far. Its roots also go quite deep. And if you remove the main plant, but all of these little parts remain, they can all independently grow as their own plants. So it's a pretty impressive adversary, but we will talk about plenty of techniques that are generally effective against it. And then while we're talking about things you might need to deal with in your garden, here are some of the most common weeds to be aware of while you're dealing with turf removal. There are plenty of weeds to know about, but here are the ones that kind of tend to blend into turf in Southern California, and then you might find out that you have them once the rest of the turf is gone. This is crabgrass, which is the seed looks actually kind of similar. The seed heads look kind of similar to Bermuda, but it's an individual plant. It kind of has a fuzzier leaf, and it has just a really deep root, spreads really easily from seed and can be worked to pull out. But a lot of the techniques we're going to talk about work very well with it. Yellow nutsedge is also a contender, something to not wait on. If it comes up in your garden, you're going to want to take care of it so it does not spread. It's one that you often might not realize you have. So what you can see here on the upper left is when it's mixed in with the lawn, it's easy to not see because it's generally just a little glossier and kind of a little more of a yellowish tint than the actual turf grass. But once the lawn goes away, if you see these individual plants with these blades that have a crease in it, they're kind of shiny coming up, that's nutsedge. If you carefully pull one out, you might get some of these nuts, but these nuts, which are why it's called nutsedge, often remain in the soil. They're loosely attached to the root, and that's a survival strategy of it, because once the main part is pulled, each one of these can grow into its own plant. And you can see they don't need to be that big before they start developing the nuts. If you let it completely grow to where it goes to flower, which will never happen in a lawn, it almost becomes a small little papyrus-like flower. They look pretty interesting, but then these can go to seed and spread even more. They do like water. So as your water-wise or native garden eventually transitions to becoming established and being watered much less, the pressure from the nutsedge tends to decrease, but you don't want to wait that long, because in that first year when you're watering once a week to establish your plants, that's enough, and this stuff can really spread. Basically, what you want to do is, we'll talk about some techniques that will help knock it back, but if it comes back, and this is something that I have a couple areas in my yard where even a couple of years after we're starting to work on the garden, it still comes back a little bit, way less than before. Just as soon as you see it, pull it out. Eventually it will become exhausted because it won't be able to kind of store up the energy to build more and more nuts. So now, again, it's a simple thing for me. It's just kind of mixed in very occasionally with other weeding, but it is one to be aware of. When you see that pattern, prioritize getting rid of it. You don't want to let it go for months and allow it to start building up that energy. Annual bluegrass. This is, or sometimes called POA. This is just a small annual grass. This one is actually pretty easy to deal with some of the techniques that we're talking about, but it spreads easily from seed. And so it is one that, like, I had this in my front yard once the main lawn was kind of on its way out or very dormant. This in the cool season started to really see it show up. And then finally, oxalis. There's a number of different species of oxalis, but they are the things that look at first glance kind of like a clover, have those bright yellow flowers. In their own way, they're kind of pretty, but they can be an aggressive weed. And we will talk about sheet mulching is the easiest way to deal with them, or cardboard mulching, which we will talk about extensively. They grow in the cool season here in Southern California into the spring and then kind of die back once it really starts getting hot. But they always die back to this very fleshy tuber, which, if there's enough of it, can be pretty aggressive in the garden and just sort of compete with other plants. And so this is one that I encourage you, with no matter what technique you're using, if it starts coming up in a part of your garden, you can use that sheet mulch or cardboard technique to smother it, and that really helps deal with it. It's hard to exhaust by pulling because it has those big tubers that store a lot of energy. And so with that kind of primer, we're going to start talking about the top turf removal methods. I only have had one question come in so far from Barbara. Feel free to keep sending in those questions if you have them. And good question from Barbara. Should we avoid composting these grasses? So Bermuda grass, I will never compost Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass always goes in the bin for me, because any part of it can root and start to spread. In theory, if you have a hot enough compost pile, perfectly turned enough times so that every single part, including the parts that in some of the process are the edges that don't heat up as much, are turned perfectly, composted for enough time at high enough heat. In theory, you can deal with all of this stuff, seeds and all. In backyard compost piles, I don't feel like I have ever seen a backyard compost pile that is so perfect in all of that stuff. And I'm talking, to do that, you'd be taking temperature readings, logging times at different temperatures, all that stuff. I say just avoid that. The Bermuda grass, in my opinion, if it's being pulled out, should go in the bin. Now, we're going to talk about smothering techniques as well. If you're smothering it with some of these techniques, it could just stay in place underneath that layer. But if it gets pulled out, like, I'm an avid home composter, but for me, that goes in the bin. For the other grasses and weeds, definitely nutsedge, always go in the bin. Same thing, very tough. Oxalis, I'll always put it in the bin. The other sort of just annual grasses, if they don't have any seeds on them, or don't have any, even like if it's really started to flower and I can't totally tell if the seed is dry and ripe, if it has those seeds, it'll go in the bin. If it's just the grassy part and it's not Bermuda, not one of the warm season grasses, I'd say, but it's a cool season grass or weedy grass, those are okay to compost. So hopefully that helps. So Sarah, I have Bermuda grass that has rhizomes hiding under the concrete edge, curling and turning into spaghetti. Yeah, we will talk about concrete edges and Bermuda grass. That's a tough spot. Very typical. They'll be under driveways, they'll be under sidewalks, and they'll have some ability to kind of keep creeping back into the landscape. So those are going to be areas that you really need to patrol as your new landscape is getting in, and areas to kind of detail and do a little extra work to deal with that as you're removing your turf. So our turf removal methods. First one and my go-to is sheet mulching or cardboard mulching, sometimes combined with other techniques. But this is essentially using free and just recycling corrugated cardboard to have a temporary biodegradable weed barrier that in general in Southern California will last anywhere between 6 months and like a bit over a year, and then eventually just kind of compost in place and break down. But in that time, it will have done its job, smothering what's underneath it. Works quite well and is generally my go-to. Not a silver bullet for Bermuda grass, but I will talk about techniques to make it more effective. But as you will see, there is no single technique, even including using toxic herbicides, that really truly at the end of the day are just totally going to deal with Bermuda grass completely and right away. I've used all of these techniques and nothing is perfect. And so in this case, this was a small front yard and we're only doing this half of the front yard. This is the place that I lived in Pomona, where we were next door to Bob with the beautiful green lawn. We were the first house in the neighborhood to pull out the lawn. As we were doing so, we were getting some very concerned looks from the neighbors. It is a historic district. At the time, it was the kind of area where people were even upset when solar panels went on the house because of the look. However, I will say by the time, as soon as we were kind of done with the project, people were very happy about it, thought it looked really interesting, and met a lot of new neighbors who wanted to come ask us and talk about the garden. In this stage, people were a little bit concerned, but we got there with everyone and there were no issues after we got it in. And so you can see the cardboard that we were using here for this technique. The ideal is brown or white, kind of matte cardboard. So you don't want to use the shiny cardboard stuff that like sometimes television or printer boxes come in, because that shiny stuff becomes a barrier to water, where the matte, just normal corrugated cardboard is permeable, allows water to come through. Also, the inks that are used on the matte cardboard are almost always a soy-based ink, but some of the inks on the shinier stuff has other compounds, which are not necessarily great to be going into the soil if you're using a lot of it. And really, it's about finding those boxes. We'll talk a little bit more about where to find them, and then laying them down with an overlap so that, again, you create this temporary weed barrier. Bermuda grass does have some ability to kind of creep up through, so it's all about the overlap. Here, because it was small, we also decided to go ahead and roughly rip out as much as we could. And we'll talk about that as a technique later. But as you can see here with just this scruff at the bottom and these little green parts, that was just kind of rough. If we immediately just went back to watering the lawn or didn't smother this stuff would come right back. So if this was a large front yard or a large backyard, we would have skipped that part and we would have just mowed it quite tight or just stomped it down, depending on how much thatch there was, and then we would have covered it. And you can see here, one of the things that we did do, which I really encourage you to do, is spending some extra time detailing the edge around the brickwork in this case. So one of the things that often happens, especially if something has been a lawn for many decades, in this case, the house was getting close to a century old and probably had lawn for most, if not all of that time in this location, is that the organic matter builds up and the soil level kind of raises compared to the walkways around it. And once you get into the landscape a little bit, that's just fine. Most of the time, we're going to be adding a mulch layer as well. And so if all of that comes right up to the walk and there's not some extra work done to kind of detail that edge, that stuff's just going to be kind of falling down onto the path. It's going to be impossible for this edge to look nice. It's going to be kind of sloppy looking. So I encourage you to come with a shovel. Eventually we dug out just a little bit more here, and then you can see even clearer in some other slides I'll show of how we detailed the edge. And going through with at least a trenching shovel, if not a wider shovel afterwards, helps make that transition a little bit easier. You dig down a little bit deeper on the edge so you can get your nice like 1 inch of mulch, or you can put in some rocks or something to retain that edge. Also helps you get out a little bit more of that Bermuda grass, physically dig it out. Even if you're not digging out the grass in the rest of the landscape and just smothering it, extra detail work at the edge really pays off well in terms of the look of the landscape. If you get a lot of weeds growing back and mulch kind of falling onto the pathway, even though it's such a small proportion of the landscape, the eye immediately notices it. It just really doesn't look good. Also, as you're doing that, you should be thinking about your irrigation system, because you are putting down this layer of cardboard, which is going to be this weed barrier for at least a year. If there's any work you need to do with pipes, with capping sprinklers, with setting up the drip irrigation system, that would go underneath that cardboard. If you have a drip system, it's going to go underneath that cardboard, because even though the cardboard is permeable, the water would kind of spread. It wouldn't soak in the exact way. Or if you have a spray system that you're making modifications to, you need to do that work before that cardboard and mulch goes down, and mark your sprinkler locations so you don't accidentally cover them with cardboard and prevent them from functioning. So here we are doing some work to convert to different irrigation type and going from there. A lot of the area, we just got rid of the irrigation and we were going to hand water, which if you're devoted to it and it's a small front yard, can be an approach that works. If it's a large front yard, or if you're really not trying to spend a lot of time in your garden, it is, I would consider it best practice to invest in a well-designed and installed irrigation system. So just a note, and if you're interested in kind of irrigation options for a turf replacement project like this, we have a whole workshop about it. I would encourage you to check the recording on our YouTube channel, and that is retrofitting turf irrigation systems for water-wise and native gardens, which talks about all of your options to plan out before you're at this phase and what to do before this phase, assuming that you're starting with a semi-functional, might not be great, but semi-functional, at least no breaks in the pipes, turf irrigation system. There are definitely ways, even if you're going to drip or significantly changing it, to use all of that underground pipe, mostly work with adapters, and not generally have to do any more trenching or very minimal, but make use of the best of what's there already. So that's the retrofitting turf irrigation systems for water-wise and native gardens workshop on the YouTube channel. And so here you can see we defined a pathway area lined by just local rock that we acquired, and then a main planting area. So to have the best overlap, we laid out what was going to be under the pathway area, and then made sure that there was some cardboard going out to the other side, and then we continued the pattern. You can also see here that as we did some of that work, we punctured in some places the cardboard and then used smaller boxes to kind of patch that up, making sure that there weren't weak spots that were going to let the weeds come back through. And in this case, because we were working with fruit trees, and then we were also going to be working with some herbs, there was a couple of native plants in here, but it wasn't really a particularly native focused landscape when we were installing it. We also did take this chance to bring in and top dress the area with some compost. So you can see here, if you are going to add compost, put it underneath. If you're working with water-wise Mediterranean native plants, generally you're going to be working with plants that are going to be chosen to be adapted to your soil type. And unless you have crazy, crazy heavy clay soil, you don't need to add any compost. The native plants don't really care. It's just more stuff that you would have to do an expense. And then continuing to add cardboard, paying a lot of attention to the overlap. If you have Bermuda grass, ideally like 9 inches of overlap. And in pathway areas, I might go completely at least 2 layers of cardboard thick if I have enough. In this case, the owner of this house, our landlord, owned a solar panel installation company. And so we were able to get his old solar panel boxes, which were just perfect because the larger boxes that you have, the easier it is to tile them out. Sometimes you might need to cut some of the edges and then get a nice overlap and have the fewest seams. So that's great. We'll talk a little bit more about ideas of where to get the boxes a little bit later. So working with the different sizes. One quick note that I forgot to mention at the beginning is you want to make sure you have decent soil moisture, not muddy, not super wet before you start this process. And so really what I prefer to have people do is water the heck out of the landscape like a week or so before you're going to start doing the work of covering it all up. If you're going to roughly tear out the turf, you can, ideally you want things to be a little bit moist, not muddy as well, because it's just easier to dig. And then you might even water it again deeply one more time, because when you put this down, if there's moisture in the soil, you can kind of lock that in. But if it's very dry, it's permeable, but it's still at the beginning can create just a little bit of a barrier to really getting that deep recharge of the soil. So really water well, and then let it dry out for a few days. If you have sandy soil, letting it dry out for 3-4 days, probably enough, because you don't want it to be sopping wet and then getting compacted or squishy when you're working on it. If you have heavy clay soil, you might wait kind of up to a week. If you don't have a irrigation system that's functional for that space, that's fine. It's going to be very hard with a hose to deliver that amount of water evenly at a pace where it's not going to pool up. So it might be worth investing in just like one of those cheap oscillating fan sprinklers from the hardware store connected to a hose, just to be able to do that deep soak, or borrow one from someone else. So maybe a neighbor has one or something like that. And with that, after you lay down your cardboard, you're going to want to then water the surface really well with a hose. So you can see here how that cardboard that was kind of sticking up in all directions, once you water it really well, kind of starts to slump down and conform exactly to the soil surface. You can see here how we were taking some care to tuck down at the edges, not completely done yet, but kind of tuck in to the extent possible at the edges so that there's an absolute minimum amount of grass that can come up, and that can't really be done until there's a little bit of moisture and flexibility in that cardboard. And generally with cardboard, you might need to come back around about 3 times to get it to get sopping wet enough to be able to kind of accept that moisture. So often what I'll do is I'll water one area till the water is really starting to slide off the cardboard, do another area, kind of loop back around. And then you add your mulch, and it's kind of a balance. You want to get the cardboard wet enough to do that, but not so sopping wet that you can't get in there to add your mulch. Sometimes what I'll do, even though it makes a little bit more work, is I will mulch an area and then run over that mulched area with the wheelbarrow to mulch the farther area. It's a little bit harder to push that wheelbarrow through the mulch, but that helps distribute the weight of that wheelbarrow tire and makes it much less likely that I'm going to be shifting the cardboard or tearing through it or anything like that. And so you can see here, just adding the wood chip mulch. And then in the center pathway, we did it as a pea gravel pathway. So this was a week later. And even at this point, before the garden had really started to grow in, those skeptical neighbors were plenty happy and very enthusiastic about what we had done, because it shows intention. It's not a completely finished garden, but it definitely doesn't look abandoned. And in fact, it looked like there's more care put into it than a lot of the lawns in the area. And so you can see here what we decided to do, because the area was a little bit raised, is on top of that cardboard, we then put down the just local kind of cobblestone, river rock, and then that nicely kind of keeps everything contained. So a number of questions that have come in, and then we will talk more about some of these nitty-gritty details. From Katie, great comment. Be sure to remove the tape from the boxes. It's worth the effort. Yeah, I have done both. These days, I am a proponent of taking the time to remove the tape from the boxes. Ultimately, if you don't do that, what will happen is over time, the mulch will break down and then there'll be bits of tape in your landscape, and you can remove them later, but some of it starts to break down and becomes little microplastic sort of stuff. So it's worth it. It's something that if there are kids around, the kids can help with and contribute, or just whoever. But yeah, it's worth it. From Amy, what type of grass were we dealing with? A mix. There was definitely Bermuda grass in it. There was some fescue, I'm sure, as well. Rachel, does this mulching process work the same to kill weeds in a rose bed? I was fearful that I would kill my rose plants, and in mulching the lawn, I might kill a few small crepe myrtles. Absolutely works, and it is my absolute favorite technique for working around existing plants, because a lot of the other techniques will negatively impact the roots in the soil, and this will not. And in fact, as long as you make sure that you lock that moisture in and that you are still watering appropriately, this can actually give a boost to the beneficial soil life. In fact, the beneficial soil fungus really likes growing into the corrugations of the cardboard and breaking down the glues in the cardboard. Once you lock in that moisture and put the cardboard on top of it, even though you're still going to be watering your normal schedule for the existing plants, I've seen earthworms come back in areas that I didn't think there were any. It really kind of gives the soil a boost. I've done it extensively around existing plants, under and around trees, especially even a lot of existing trees. You have to be really careful with even physically digging out turf because of the feeder roots. And oftentimes, if the trees have been growing in a lawn, they have a lot of surface roots. And so this sheet mulching technique means that you can leave all of that stuff in place, just smother the turf. You don't need to disturb the roots or anything like that. So yes, absolutely works for weeds and is a technique overall that is really one of my go-tos. And you'll see an example in just a little bit of how we've used it in areas that are just kind of weedy. Rachel, who could I seek out to complete this type of job using this process to kill the lawns and weeds if I am able to do it myself? Is it the common job offered by landscapers? It is not a common job offered by landscapers. However, lots of landscapers, in my experience, are happy to take on something and will give you a price if you know specifically what you want. If you are going to have landscapers do it, there are a few, like in Southern California, I've heard of, kind of more specialize in ecological landscaping, tend to be more high-end and more costly landscapers, that this is part of their normal process, but it's not that common. So if you are going to hire a normal landscaper, you're going to definitely need to explain what you want. And you will also, if it's kind of this cardboard, probably need to scavenge the cardboard yourself, because the cardboard is free, but it's time intensive to acquire. Or we're going to talk about an option which in some circumstances will work, of just using painter's paper, and I'll show the product. And that is something that could just be purchased, although you still probably would need to purchase the materials yourself. And I think more and more landscapers do know about it, but the typical landscaper probably doesn't. The typical landscaper will probably try to sell you on using the black kind of plastic weed barrier instead. We will talk about that and why I don't recommend that. From Barbara, how do you deal with the raised depth of the edges if you don't have a border between the sidewalk and the lawn? Do you need to add rocks or some type of barrier? You have a couple of options. You can use rocks or some type of barrier if you want, or what I will more often or not do is I will dig out and dig down a little bit just along the edge, and maybe from like the edge where the lawn hits the sidewalk till about 1 foot back, maybe even less, about the width of a standard shovel, so maybe 10 inches back. I will dig that out about just an inch or so below the sidewalk, and then it could taper up. So there would be some removal, but what that lets happen is that there's a gradual slope down, and then you have a depth that you can apply your mulch, whether it's wood chip or gravel, and have everything come together nicely. So, and then once it's, a foot or so away, it's okay if the level is higher than the sidewalk around. Diane, will the cardboard break down and eventually weeds go through? Would some type of fabric be better? The advantage to the cardboard is that it lasts for a long enough time to smother the current weeds. Unless Bermuda grass has some ability to kind of, creep through. Like I mentioned, some stuff will creep through and you just pull it out right away. But the vast majority of the weeds will get smothered underneath. By the time you are 6, 9 months, a year out, then that's breaking down, but that crop of weeds that was alive is dead. On top of that cardboard, you have your wood chip or your gravel or your decomposed granite layer of mulch. Weed seeds need to be pretty close to the top of the soil surface to germinate. And so if they are underneath the mulch layer, even if the cardboard is broken down, they should never see the light of day and won't be able to germinate. That's why it works. And then we'll talk specifically about the fabric in just a bit and why I can't recommend it. Okay, so a lot of questions coming in. I will get through these and then we should probably get going, but we're still going to be on sheet mulch for a while, so we will have time for more questions, another round, but I'll answer the two that are in here. So I work from home, and last year when I started, I brought home boxes of files printed on regular printer paper. Found that I don't need all those paper copies and have been shredding them. Could I use half-inch stacks of that paper overlapping to supplement cardboard? You could try. I probably wouldn't go all the way to half-inch because with the cardboard, the corrugations kind of help allow water and air to percolate through, but you can try a thickness. I just don't know. There's a lot of overlaps. I'll show you when I show you how I use newspaper. Sometimes you will see that would probably be my main suggestion of how to use that. Normal printer paper, each sheet is so small that even with an overlap, I worry that stuff would be able to creep through, but you can kind of try it and figure out. It's not a hard no, but I just don't have the experience and I'm a little skeptical. The boxes that you brought that paper home in would probably be fine to use. Again, there'll be like a lot of seams, but you can kind of patch those together. Suggestions for Bermuda grass coming up through blacktop driveway. Yeah, that's a challenge for sure. Traditionally, people have used herbicides, though I can't recommend it, and we'll talk about why on herbicides. Vinegar is something that some people are now using as an alternative. There are specific vinegars, which are just a concentrated normal vinegar, which are marketed as herbicides, and you can find those online from like organic garden supply stores. And if it's blacktop and there's nothing around it, you can apply those at a high concentration. I know some people that have tried using just straight vinegar undiluted from the bottle. With Bermuda grass, that might burn the top. It'll probably still come back and just staying on top of it. And then also a great tool to have if you have issues as well. And it depends on how much, but like I have a totally busted up asphalt driveway and we do get weeds coming through, and I have a little tool. They make a few different designs of little tools specifically meant for weeding in cracks. Most of them are pretty inexpensive. They're just like a little plastic handle and some sort of thin metal hook that helps you get in there and pull it out. So if you just have a little bit and to stay on top of it, that might be enough. That's really all I need. And then just a number of times of year, we need to attend to that just as part of the normal maintenance of the property. Okay, cool. So let's keep going. So talking about timelines, if you are going to combine this sheet mulching technique with either of the techniques we're going to talk about next, which is digging out the grass or solarizing, you can do either of those first and then sheet mulch and plant at the same time. If you are using the sheet mulching as the primary method to kill the grass, so you're not digging out the grass, or you're not going to use that other technique called solarizing, which is just fine, it's going to take some time for the grass really to start to die off. And so you don't want to plant at the exact same time, because just in those little holes for the plantings, there might be a lot of grass that just kind of grows right out into the sunlight. So if you're going to be using sheet mulching as your primary technique to kill the grass, ideally you'll wait about 8 weeks before planting, so you can get your cardboard down, get your mulch layer down, and then you're just going to kind of pull the mulch back and cut down into the cardboard in your planting locations. And then you'll be digging out some thatch of mostly dead weeds or grass, and then the soil in your planting locations. I will show a kind of specialty garden tool called a hori hori later when I talk about weeding. That's the perfect thing for cutting through that cardboard later. However, also an old serrated kitchen knife, or especially like a larger old bread knife, would work quite well as well. Or you might like get a cheap one at Ross or something like that. You don't obviously want to use the one that will be going back into your kitchen. All the irrigation work should be completed if you're doing work for your new garden before the cardboard goes down. And the sheet mulch could be applied at any time of the year. But if you have that Bermuda or that warm season grass, realize that even if you smother it in the coolest part of the year or in the winter, it's kind of wanting to go dormant anyways, even if it's kind of green. And so you're not really going to quite know how effective things were until later on. So for killing that warm season grass, it's ideal to apply the sheet mulch in the spring or the summer, so you're smothering it at the time that it really wants to grow. Or, late, if you're going to do a fall planting, which at this point in time for the timeline, if you're just thinking about turf removal, is probably going to be the best thing for Southern California. Planning on planting probably between Thanksgiving and New Year's is really kind of what I think of as the sweet spot. Then kind of working your schedule back out, irrigation work, any big soil moving before that, and then your sheet mulching about 8 weeks before planting. So in the late summer to very early fall. Other important notes. We mentioned water very well before putting down the cardboard, but make sure it's not muddy. That overlap is essential. 6 to 9 inches is ideal, 6 absolute minimum, 9 or more if there's Bermuda grass. Those are going to be the weak spots for things creeping back through, which is why larger sheets are the best. Water that cardboard. After you put down the mulch, water it all very well as well, just to kind of settle the dust, bring up the ambient moisture. And it's an investment of water. So it's a technique that takes some water, but really locks in some really great moisture. And then talked about the cutting through the cardboard if you're going to come back later. So the next season, we took on the other side of the yard, one part at a time to keep it manageable. And so you can see here, turf being dug out. Turf was thicker on this side because here we had the border with Bob's lawn, which was very lush and well taken care of. And on this side, there was a lot of water coming right down off the roof. So we actually dug an infiltration area. So instead of all kind of running off down the pathway area, because the just thatch of the turf had made it to be a higher area than the pathway where the water would land, kind of dug this out more. So we have this basin where the water could infiltrate, help hydrate the fruit trees. And then on this side, we didn't have access to as many rocks. So used some redwood bender board to define the path. Didn't perfectly match, but work with what you have access to. We had very little budget for the project. We're just trying something different. So here you can see what we're starting with. And you can see here the trench that we did down on this side as well to be able to have that nice mulch edge where this kind of raised concrete curbing was. In the path area, using just a hand tamper to firm down that soil. And then this is really important. If you are removing a lawn, but it's at a shared property line with a property that there is going to be lawn continuing to exist, you are going to want to do something to make sure that that lawn doesn't keep growing back into your garden. And so we did a couple of things. One is we intentionally cited this pathway to go through this border area and for the border to have the path, which worked for the aesthetic and the existing tree layout as well, so that it's sort of a buffer zone. So the lawn area can't go right into our planting. And then an inexpensive way of doing a root barrier is I dug about a 1 foot deep trench down what we're informing the next door neighbor that we're taking on this project. We kind of looked, made sure that we agreed upon where this kind of rough property line of the edge should be. You can see the property line here wasn't perfect for how the fencing went in the past, so made sure that we're both on the same page with that. And then when that trench was open, put in visqueen, basically that thick plastic that you can get in the paint section of the hardware store, buried about a foot deep, backfilled, and so the roots also lower down, can't go through. And then eventually we just put some rock here, kind of obscuring the plastic, which we had just kind of folded up against the edge of the walk. And then the neighbor was able to use a string trimmer to edge up against the rocks without breaking up this plastic. And so that's just what worked in this solution. Your solution might be slightly different, but plan on it because that stuff will try to come back, especially if there's Bermuda grass. Really need to do the root layer. If there's not Bermuda grass and it's just fescue, you might just be able to edge it, but plan on something. Here, did a little bit of loosening to make sure the soil was nice and loose at the bottom of that infiltration area. Here I am watering. We didn't have a functional irrigation system at all. So even though I don't recommend using a hose because it takes a long time to get that level of hydration up, that's what I did in this point. And it works. You just need to keep coming back throughout the course of a day. Our cardboard layering. While that was wet, starting to roughly add wood chip to hold it down, but then coming back and redetailing the edges. So when I did that wood chip, I didn't bring it all the way to the edge. And then here is where you might use like paper. Here we had access at this point in time to back issues of a local newspaper, Claremont Courier, that were just going to get recycled. I don't remember how we acquired these, but we did. And then just using whole issues. So this is maybe of newsprint, 20 something pages thick. And then just using that because they're small, kind of tiling to really get tightly up against this whole edge because there was Bermuda grass underneath the concrete. And then marking your sprinkler locations, making sure that you leave a little gap so that those sprinklers can still come up. I think we were adapting from here. I don't remember what was going on with the irrigation system. This was many years ago, but that was a location that I think we had a pipe going to it and maybe a capped riser, but we wanted to make sure we could access it eventually. Quick question that I saw came in from Sarah. Why do we not use plastic bender board and what do we think of steel? Didn't use plastic bender board because I absolutely hate plastic bender board. It is easy to work with, so I will say that. And in the past, I have used it, like when I needed to edge up against a lawn at a place that I was renting and wanted to put in a garden, but we knew we wouldn't be there for that long. Did use it because it's cheap, it's easy to work with, it's flexible. But for something long term, the plastic bender board, in my opinion, doesn't look good for very long. It tends to fade and look like faded plastic, which is not what I want to see in my garden compared to other materials after a few years. It also is the way it bends, especially once it's been in the sun, is kind of a little too bendy. It's hard to get a really nice, graceful line out of it. And the stakes that come with that system tend to not go very deep. You can supplement it with other stakes, but the ones that come with the plastic bender board just don't go deep enough to really secure it. We are demonstration garden at the Waterwise Community Center, and I wish I was there at the time. I would have tried really hard for us to use a different product, uses it. And now that it's been about 7 years since that vendor board went in. It's a mess. It's raising in places. It's really hard to, repair without pulling it all out and replacing it. So it's just kind of a nightmare. I love steel. Steel is my preferred product. The local landscape supply stores, so not like Home Depot, but most of the local landscape supply stores that mostly sell to contractors, but they pretty much all sell to the public. Sometimes they need to special order it. Oftentimes they stock it, have a pretty similar steel bender board where there's an overlap in between parts and a loop, and there's steel stakes that go in, and you can get extra steel stakes to help you on a curve. They're deeper than the plastic ones. That's really what I always prefer to use. Depending on the radius of your curve, it can take quite a bit of strength to bend. You can't do any shape, and it is hard to cut. I mean, you definitely need to use either a lot of elbow grease, a lot of strength, and a hacksaw to get through it, or it cuts pretty well with the Sawzall or the proper grinding wheel on an angle grinder. But you do have to put that work into it or be handy with tools. So that is a drawback, but that's absolutely what I would always use on a residential job that I really want to last long and look good, or a commercial job would be steel edging. As well, that would have been the ideal application for here. Anything near where there might be string trimmers long-term, steel edging. So if I was to redo this project today, I would have gone with steel as well. In this case, the landlord was buying the supplies, and the redwood is what he wanted to go with. So that was fine too. And here we go. This is a little bit wild and weedy because a lot of these were just annual wildflowers that came up, but here it is a number of months later. And so you can see here kind of that nice edging so that we're able to have things at the right level. So this works equally well for just weedy areas. This is was always a problematic area towards the back of our WaterWise Community Center demonstration garden. Today we call it our DIY demonstration area, because when we teach workshops in person, which eventually we will resume, but not for the immediate future, we'll get out here, we'll plant things. It's kind of not a specific, like sacred place that we don't want people walking through anything, but it had never had a permanent use. I think the construction trailers were here when the main garden was being built. The soil was very compact, didn't drain well, and just a lot of weed seed. So you can see everything here. This was weeds that had come up, had been cut back with a string trimmer. And so this wasn't turf, just lots and lots of weeds. So cut everything back so we can get a nice semi-flat surface, laying out cardboard. Overlap here, you can see we're working with smaller boxes. This is just what we were able to scavenge and scrounge, different things that had come in the mail over time, other places that were getting rid of boxes. One of our coworkers, like Mom's Work, was getting rid of some boxes. You can see even like flats of cat food cans and little overlap areas. It's working with what we had. So that works too. And so watered well beforehand. Here you can see Zach, our intern at the time, doing that watering so everything slumps down. So here's an example of, not the end of the world if this happens to you, but what you want to do is you want to only water down the section that you are going to be mulching relatively soon. And if it's a breezy day at all, you might be mulching or putting cardboard down in just one area, then mulching, leaving like a couple of feet for your overlap, and then proceeding so it doesn't blow around. If you water the cardboard and then it dries out, it'll curl back up. You can go through the process of re-watering it and it'll flop back down again. But this is what happens if you water and then it's like a lunch break or something, and then you come back. So wait till you can do it all at once. Then piling up the wood chip mulch, and then just using a bow rake or a hard tooth rake. It's the preferred tool to rake it back out. And there you go. So where do you get that much cardboard? Local auto body or bike shops are great to get in touch with, both auto body shops because of bringing in bumpers and things like that, or bike shops because bikes ship in big cardboard boxes often. Uh, Go through lots of cardboard. They're trying to get rid of it and they fill dumpsters they need to pay to get it disposed of. So I know people who have worked with both of those, and the local shop has been willing to put stuff aside for however long. They stop by once a week and pick it up or something like that. So those would be my go-tos because those tend to be huge boxes. Contractors who regularly do things like install kitchen cabinets are a potentially good source. That's my source of cardboard. There's a contractor who lives a block over from me, and when he installs kitchens, which he does semi-regularly, he knows he can give me a call, and if I am at a point where I need cardboard, he can just leave all those boxes in my driveway instead of needing to dispose of it himself. And so that's how we have done most of our sheet mulching at the place where we are now. Small businesses that deliver appliances, like I don't think you would get Home Depot interested, but smaller appliance deliveries, local solar business, or also sometimes people who work at large volume retail or coffee shops have access to lots of boxes. So those are going to be smaller boxes. But for example, I helped someone out with a design who was doing their front yard, and it was a decent sized front yard. So she worked at Starbucks. And so even though there were smaller boxes, she said, in a week, she could put aside the boxes and have enough boxes to do her whole yard. So she just did lots of overlap, and that works fine as well. If that's the thing that you have the best access to, just remember, avoid those shiny or colorful boxes. And then another alternative, if the box thing just isn't going to work out for you, is to use rolls of painter's paper. They're available for purchase in the paint section of definitely the big box hardware stores. Home Depot and Lowe's both have them. You're going to want to use your widest possible width, which is something like 32, 35 inches. They normally come in brown and red. Use the brown, never use the red. The red has like a rosin layer in it, which is great if you spill a bucket of paint on a floor inside a house because it helps make a waterproof layer, but it's the opposite of what you want if you're mulching in a garden. You want that water to be able to get through. If you're doing a whole yard, the cost can add up surprisingly quickly, especially because I really recommend you do at least 2 layers, if not more. And it's not as effective as cardboard for Bermuda grass because it's just a thick sheet of this, paper is not going to last as long as overlapped corrugated cardboard, but it's pretty good for just a general weedy area. So if you're doing like weedy borders or planting beds that aren't super deep, especially if you're working around a lot of existing plants, this is a pretty good alternative. If you are going to use it on a turf removal project, generally would recommend combining it with the techniques we're going to talk about, either digging it out or solarization first, and then using this as kind of like a top off security layer. And it's not quite as good for building soil, kind of bringing all that life back to the soil, like I talked about for the cardboard, but it's something that can work in the appropriate place. And so here's an example. This is adjacent to the area at our Waterwise Community Center garden that I just showed. We had a kind of weedy border that we relatively recently replanted as a demonstration of what we call a habitat hedge, which is working with a variety of native plants, but all that can kind of grow together into a diverse hedge. And that will be really, really great for birds, butterflies, and pollinators. And we didn't have any more cardboard and just kind of wanted to knock this out with the planting. And so we got a number of these paper rolls. We did 2 layers. Definitely easiest as a 2-person job, 1 person to kind of weight down one side, the other person to roll and cut, and then wood chip mulch can go off after that. And then just any sort of decent heavy duty scissors to cut the openings around the plants. And that's worked very well for us. And there's been very, very little weed regrowth, especially that area has drip irrigation. So the drippers are underneath. So the paper stays on top, doesn't get a whole lot of moisture. And then newspapers, if you do it, thick layer of many sheets, and generally I only do it for edging or small fussy areas that would be hard to do with cardboard. So Barbara, great question. During the 8 weeks, are we watering the mulch at all? what you might do is kind of poke down into the soil every once in a while and see if it's really starting to get dry. The wood chip mulch on the top, doesn't really need it. You might water it every couple of weeks, a good deep soak, just to make sure that there's still some moisture in the soil. But there's no hard and fast rule. Also depends on what time of year you're doing it. But if you're doing it in the summer, you might get some water down every few weeks, just to make sure that that there's enough moisture that you're really killing the turf and not just having it go dormant underneath. From BW, do you encounter issues with the neighbor's seeds after you mow the lawn going into the gravel pathway? So in that particular instance, no, but that was a lawn that got mowed pretty religiously, so there were not a lot of seeds in that lawn. It could be an issue depending on the neighbor. We're going to talk about in just a second the woven weed barriers. If that is of concern, underneath a gravel pathway, in my opinion, is an appropriate place to use one of these kind of woven weed barriers if that's really going to be an issue. But we weren't that worried about it there, and it turned out, at least in the time that I continued to live there, it turned out to be fine. Okay. From Lee, you indicated putting in your irrigation before the cardboard mulching. If you do not have an irrigation system in place, nor the money to put one in, can we use above ground irrigation system using poly tubing or drip line tubing after lawn removal? Good question. Yes, there are no absolutes. So you can water by hand if you want. I normally don't do it for a front yard area just because of the sidewalk and kind of water kind of washing off. But like for my backyard, most of my native landscape in my backyard where we only water once a month, I didn't even bother putting in a permanent irrigation system. I just use a hose connected to an old school like fan sprinkler. I have one that's kind of adjustable, so I can really kind of dial it in for the space. And I once a month apply an inch of water, which I know because I put a couple of jars out when I do it, and I wait till there's some water in. And so yeah, you don't necessarily need something long term, but for a front yard where the fan sprinkler might be getting onto the sidewalk and stuff like that, it's ideal. Yes, you can absolutely do a poly tubing or drip line after. What I would recommend is, like, say you're installing it a year later or something like that, you're going to want to generally, you don't need to get it down into the soil. You're just going to want to rake back the wood chip mulch so that you can at least get the tubing buried in the wood chip and then go from there. And that's just fine. If you're doing it many months later, or especially like even a year later, the cardboard's going to start getting to where it's broken down, where it's not going to be that much of an issue either. So yeah, that's okay. It saves work to do it ahead of time, just because then it could easily all kind of go down underneath the cardboard. But yeah, not absolutely necessary. And from Sarah, will the Bermuda grass truly die? I wish I had a better answer for you, but it depends. It is just as likely to truly die as any other turf removal technique I have used, including multiple applications of herbicide, which I don't really do anymore, but I have done it. I've tried everything. I got into horticulture as a completely organic gardener, was not happy the first time I tried using herbicide, but it was in a case where Bermuda grass had just like more than taken over a huge landscape. And I was like, I just need to try it. We're installing an ecosystem afterwards. And if it works, then it'll work. And that was a commercial scale site where I had tried sheet mulching multiple times. And at that scale, multi-acre site, wherever I stopped sheet mulching, the Bermuda grass would go out and come back. But since then, over the years, I had used everything, including multiple applications of herbicides on residential landscapes, and have found that some Bermuda grass is always going to come back. So you might as well stick with the more organic techniques is basically how it works. If there's a lot of pressure and if the site is small enough to where you can use the next techniques we're going to talk about, which are solarization and or digging out, before you sheet mulch to combine the two, then that is absolutely an ideal if the scale of the site is right, and then there's the time and kind of the ability to do that. But yeah, you can do it. So Sarah, slowly digging 8 to 10 inches down, 2,000 square feet or so far. I admire your work. That's beyond what most people can do. That will hugely help. It'll hugely help. In my experience, there will always be some that comes back. So I would still consider, at least in areas where you suspect it's the worst, doing some cardboard or the paper just as a final layer. But 2,000 square feet is a pretty large area. So, I would say it would be the best practice to even combine that. But you're going to do, the best. We're all going to do the best we're going to do. And it all depends on time, amount of physical labor that's available, size of the project, budget. There's no silver bullet this is the one thing to do in all cases. So jumping back into the slides, why I don't recommend the plastic woven weed barriers. Usually it's the black fabric from the hardware landscape store. Sometimes it's a tan fabric, but whatever it is, if it is made out of some sort of poly, basically these are all plastic. Occasionally, like I'll see ones that are basically paper, which you can mail order. Usually I don't see them locally, but essentially they're the same thing as the painter's paper you can get at the hardware store, the ones that I've tried. So the woven stuff, landscapers, contractors love to use this stuff because it's quick. They can roughly rip out the turf with their guys using picks and shovels, lay this down, cover it with mulch, call the job done. And that's understandable with how a contractor wants to make a living, get the products from the landscape supply store. And in their defense, it is marketed as this stuff is permeable to water, permeable to air, lasts a long time. And if that was the case, that'd be one thing. But here's just the reality. In most cases, this is what happens. I can't say that this never works. I have talked with literally one person who said, yeah, I did it 6 years ago. It's still going strong. Most people who I talk with who have tried it end up here, which is over time, especially if you have a wood chip mulch on top of this fabric. As that wood chip mulch breaks down, kind of becomes compost, all of that still sits on top of the weed barrier. As those particles break down and become smaller and smaller, they start to clog up the little pore spaces in the weed barrier. And so all of those benefits of mulch, where it's going to break down and compost in place and slowly increase the soil fertility and raise organic matter, that's cut off from the soil. It just starts to clog. And so then what's happening is there's reduced air and water permeability down into the soil. Irrigation doesn't work as well. When it rains, the soil doesn't get hydrated, and the roots need air as well. And that starts to get cut off. That cycling of organic matter is cut off. And as that starts to break down, there's that little layer of compost on top of the weed barrier, which is perfect for weed seeds to germinate. And so after a number of years, you're having to weed on top of your weed barrier while the soil underneath that should be supporting your plants is getting dry and not enough air. It's the opposite of what we want long term. So yeah, it'll be quick. It might look great a couple weeks later. But what I want to do is set you up for gardens that are going to look great 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later. And this is just not a way to get there. You can see here, even with gravel mulch, this had started to happen. In my opinion, depending on the site, if you are using gravel mulch, depending on the plants you're using, because the gravel has very little organic matter, there have been times where I've said, yeah, go ahead and do this. For example, I helped a fire station that was in a very agricultural area that there was just like, they were surrounded by farm fields that all the edges of the farm fields were just like weeds, blowing seed into their landscape all the time, and they wanted to remove their turf. Much more extreme than I've seen in pretty much any suburban yard. And they were going mostly with succulents and some colorful native desert shrubs. In that case, and it was going to be a kind of gravel and rock mulch. In that case, I did say, well, yeah, that might be the only thing that's going to help. There's these disadvantages, watch out for it. But that was just like crazy extreme weed pressure. Seeds were going to be blowing in all the time that they couldn't do anything about. But for the normal yard, this just isn't a long-term successful situation. Eventually, this stuff starts to break down, and then you're pulling out chunks of plastic for many, many years as well. Whereas with the other stuff, with the cardboard or the paper, you know it's going to break down, and then when it does, it just becomes part of the mulch kind of compost layer, goes away. Would I recommend weed barrier for gravel pathway not intended for planting? If you are worried about weeds, sure. If you are not particularly worried about weeds, then keep it simple. Don't worry about it. But yeah, for underneath like a decomposed granite patio, a gravel pathway, I do often use it. If you are going to do that, just be aware with these products, it kind of is what you get is what you pay for. So the little bit, especially for underneath the gravel path, the little bit thicker, a little bit better manufactured stuff that you can generally get from like a specialty landscape supply store versus just like what they have at the Home Depot is going to be better. Or if you are getting it from the big box store, they'll kind of have levels of quality sometimes. It'd be worth it to spring for the more expensive stuff. You don't want to have to get back underneath the gravel pathway, ideally ever. Pull out the gravel, replace the weed barrier if there's weeds. So go for the kind of the best quality product that you can get for that situation if you're going to do that. Okay, so moving on to our next technique, which if you have a ton of pressure from the Bermuda grass, you can combine. You can use solarization and then do the paper, the cardboard afterwards. Solarization is basically using clear plastic that you can get in the paint section at the hardware store to steam sterilize the top number of inches of your soil, killing roots, seeds, pathogens in the soil, everything, kind of starting fresh. In general, earthworms will go farther down into the cooler layers of the soil and come back later because the heat builds up slowly over time. It has been studied. This technique is also used as a way of both taking on weed issues as well as some soil pathogen issues in organic agriculture. And so the soil biology has been studied, and what it has found is it will sterilize all the soil biology in the top number of inches of soil, roughly around 4 inches. I mean, you don't get that heat to go super, super deep down, doesn't stay just at the top, but the beneficial soil biology just tends to recolonize the soil much faster than the pathogens. I have no idea why. I don't know if science knows why, but that's just what has been seen when they have studied that issue in organic agriculture. And it holds that that would be true for our landscapes as well. And so basically you're thinking this will cause, if done correctly, kind of complete death of everything in the landscape, 4-ish inches down. You need to water very well ahead of time because you need high soil moisture. Without the soil moisture, you won't be able to accumulate the level of heat needed. Only works in areas that get hot in the summer. So even here in Southern California, Inland Valley, sure. If you're in like Santa Monica or Santa Barbara, where you have mostly overcast days in the summer, not a guaranteed technique to work for you. And it will kill the top number of inches of roots of everything as well. So for example, in this picture, this shrub definitely has roots out into the soil. This tree might, because it's shading this area, might not get that hot, but basically like if this was well applied, I would stay farther away from the tree because I don't want to impact those roots. But if it's a typical wall-to-wall lawn area, suburban yard, then sure, you can go for it. And then the last thing to mention, or a couple of things to mention, needs to be held down tight to the soil. If it's loose and there's kind of a breeze blowing through, it's kind of flapping around, that will never accumulate the total amount of heat kind of necessary. And so to hold that down, you can use a number of things. At the landscape supply hardware store, you can get drip staples or jute staples. They're basically like U's of like a thick wire that are used for holding down either drip irrigation lines or like jute for erosion netting. And that can be used at edges like this. A number of little 1-gallon plant pots filled with soil or gravel can be used. Bricks can be used. And here it looks like there's an overlap. I think what's tucked in there, and I've seen used very well for this technique, is like old 2x4s or 2x6s, or if there's like lumber around, just to hold everything down as tight as possible. If you have Bermuda grass, anticipate the timing for this is going to be about 8 weeks in the hot part of the year. So you're thinking June, July, August, beginning of September time of year. If you have an existing tree, like you can see here with this oak tree, you might be using the solarization farther out and then using the sheet mulching only underneath the oak and even a little farther out from the edge of the canopy to protect the roots. So here's basically what to use. Clear plastic sheeting, sometimes also called visqueen. They sell it in clear and black. Has to be the clear. The black actually won't accumulate enough heat. Black soaks up heat at the surface, but what you need is basically the solar radiation to go through the plastic sheeting and to heat the soil. And so needs to be clear. And plastic sheeting, the thickness is in mil. The higher the mil, the thicker it is. The two thicknesses that will work for this are 4 mil and 6 mil. The thicker it is, obviously, the longer it will last out in the sun, but the thicker it is, the less heat transmission there is from the solar radiation as well. 4 mil, most sources say, tends to be the kind of sweet spot, the best combination of durability in the sun and allowing the best amount of heat through. At the hardware store, they're going to have this in different sizes. However, for most of the hardware stores, you can also special order online and they'll ship to the store for free. They'll have many other different sizes. So think about the total dimensions of your site and realize that the fewer overlaps you have, the easier it will be to achieve that tight kind of sheeting down on top of your surface. And that the overlaps are going to be the areas where things will slide apart. So even if you're needing to like lay down 2x4s or rocks or bricks or whatever, having fewer overlaps is going to make the job easier. So they might have a 10 by 100 foot roll in the store, but maybe ordering 20 foot by 50 foot rolls that will kind of fold out more would be better suited to your space. So for whatever the store is, I'd encourage you to check out their website and see what the different options are. And most of them will tell you the ones that they have in the store or the ones to be special ordered. You can figure it out from there. So going over the details. Again, only works in full sun, only works in the heat of summer, maybe early fall. Requires at least 8 weeks. It will kill everything in the top few inches of soil, including roots of plants you want to keep. So be careful where you're going to apply it. And Bermuda grass may be deeper rooted and might still come back some, but it'll be much less and much weaker. So kind of in the ideal situation, you might then, after doing this, do a bit of a paper layer on top or something like that. I know a commercial landscaper who's completely organic, and he swears by this process, but again, there's no silver bullet. Anticipate a little bit to come back. And we're going to look at some slides of when I did my front yard, and we'll see kind of what it looks like when it comes back. And I'll talk about kind of the process to anticipate. So the solarization process. With this one, because you want to get everything laid down tight and as close to the surface as possible, you're going to start with cutting the grass as low as possible and removing as much of the cut material as possible. And so you might start by mowing it, but then you might even go back with like a string trimmer and really try to scalp it down as much as possible. You're going to want to water deeply and make sure the soil is quite wet, at least a foot down. So if you need to dig down with a shovel some, make sure you got that penetration. That's great. Cover tightly with plastic, weigh down as needed, and then check it every once in a while. Make sure it's staying tight and weighted down. So that's the solarization process. And we are going to move to our third process, which is digging it up, physical removal. But it's about 11 o'clock now. So why don't we take our 5-minute brief break. Okay, we are back. Don't see any new questions that have come in, but if you have them, please type them into the Q&A. And we're going to be getting going with the next technique, which is just digging it up, the physical removal of the turf. This is a technique that honestly works best in relatively small yards, and especially if you have teenage children with lots of energy at home or young people with good backs. Can be done no matter who you are. There is an woman who is probably in her late 60s, early 70s, who lives on the corner across the street from my parents. And slowly over a course of a year, she dug up her whole front lawn and slowly replaced it one bit at a time, starting with the parkway, then moving to the main space with what's growing into be a beautiful California native plant. It was a slow but steady project for her, but it got her outside and she just chipped away at it a bit at a time on her own schedule. So it's not to say that and it's a decent sized front yard. So it's not to say that you can't do it, whoever you are, but it is definitely some physical work. Also, if you have like a nice loamy soil, it's going to be a lot less work than if you have super heavy clay soil or really rocky or gravelly soil as well. So things to think about. But if you do have a quite small yard, you might even do this like in the example where we did one side of the yard, one part at a time, and did a rough physical removal before the sheet mulch technique. Absolutely not necessary. In the yards where I live now, we got the space primarily because it's a large lot and didn't dig up lawns, used sheet mulching and worked just fine. Probably had a little bit more grass growth come back, but less work in the long run, and I'm still happy with that decision. Okay, so if you are going to be digging it up, physical removal, you're going to want to take an approach kind of like what you see this person doing here, where you are taking it out in chunks, kind of starting a strip and then kind of working back a strip at a time. Generally, if you are doing this, you are, as you pull up a chunk, going to want to smack off and shake off as much of the soil as possible. Leave it in place so you're not sending soil to a dump and paying for the disposal costs of soil and throwing out, it'll still be a little soil in it, but throwing out mostly plant and root, and just going a little bit at a time. Tools for the job. If you need to kind of loosen the soil to get it going, or depending on your turf type, you can use a spading or a digging fork. So this is not a pitchfork. These have thicker tines. The ones with the D handle used to be very commonly available. Sometimes you see them at garden centers. If you're a tall person at all, I'm 6 feet tall, I can only use these D handle or the short ones in a raised bed. If I try to use this in a normal garden situation long term, like if I was using this to try to lift out sod or loosen the soil, really what this style does is more like loosens the soil and lifts the roots off, and you can kind of rip it apart. I need to use one with a full length handle, or it's just killer on my back because of just the ergonomics of it. The ones with the long handle are sometimes, generally, more of something you need to find on the internet. You won't find them in a local hardware store usually, or in most cases you might just use a spade, where it will dig up a chunk of the soil, and then you're kind of just roughing it up and separating it. For any soil type except very gravelly or rocky soil, you probably will want to sharpen your shovel tip and then redo it every so often as you go throughout the day, because you are basically going to be using your shovel to cut through the sod layer. As intended as a digging tool, and traditionally the way a lot of shovels were and the way the steel was, is that you could sharpen them because essentially you are cutting through plants into soil when you are using a shovel for this sort of process. These days, shovels come with a very dull end, and that makes them less efficient. When I purchase a shovel, especially a spade, I will look at the metal and generally buy one that I anticipate I can then sharpen with just a handheld metal file, which you can get normally in the tool aisle of a hardware store, along an angle to, doesn't need to be razor sharp because that would dull pretty quickly, but just to get as generally sharpened angle. If you are very tool savvy and know how to sharpen things with like an angle grinder, you can do that as well, make it quicker. I generally just have a normal metal file, handheld metal file in my shed, and we'll use that. So for example, in the aisle of that hardware store, this is much like the shovel that I got. Wasn't the most expensive one. The most expensive one had like a black powder coating on it and all these things, which meant that it would never have a sharpened ridge at all. So for me, this was a better tool, especially for something like going through turf removal. You don't want to use a flat shovel. So the ones that go up and are flat across the top, those are generally used for transferring materials or soil, like in a big pile, into a wheelbarrow. It's the ones with the point are going to, in most cases, allow you to cut in much more easily because you're putting a lot more pressure down on less of a surface area on the leading point to try to get it into the soil. And if you are going to be doing this, you will need a wheelbarrow to move materials around. If you don't already have a wheelbarrow and you are investing in a wheelbarrow, a couple of tips. Generally, these are going to be among the more expensive ones at the hardware store, but in terms of longevity, it will be worth it. Most of the hardware stores will have one, normally costs just around $100. So it's an expensive tool, but it's worth it. And it's worth, if it fits in your budget, getting the more expensive one versus the cheaper one, because the more expensive one will last way, way, way longer. The more expensive one that I would recommend is the wheelbarrow that has a flat free tire, which means the entire inside of this tire is rubberized. Wheelbarrow tires go flat. They are very hard to fix. And when you end up needing to get a new wheelbarrow tire, that's generally like, even for another one that's pneumatic filled with air, which are hard to keep filled. And once they lose air, are really hard to pump back up and sometimes can't. That's another 20, 30 bucks right there. And you just keep having to replace them. The other thing that you'll look for generally is all steel construction. And oftentimes this all comes together with the option with the flat free tire, which means that these handles are steel instead of wood. Again, that's another area where I've had a wheelbarrow fail. And I had a wheelbarrow that did have the wood handles. And by the time I looked into the cost of replacing the wood handles, and then the wheelbarrow was a number of years old, so the metal was already getting a little thinner because it had been left out in the weather, probably sometimes when it shouldn't have been. I just ended up having to invest in a new one because the costs of fixing it back up were just not going to make any sense. So if you are making that investment, invest in a good wheelbarrow, flat free tires, all steel if you can, and it will last you much, much longer. And then here is another option that sometimes people consider, and one that I am honestly not big on, and I will tell you why. A sod cutter is something that people use, which essentially is like sod in reverse. The sod cutter will cut the turf and up to a couple inches of soil, and it can literally be rolled up. It can literally be rolled out somewhere else if you wanted to, but in situations like this is normally rolled up and disposed of. If you're going to use a sod cutter, you want to mow the lawn as low as possible so that when you get your cut, you're cutting out as much of the root as you can. Make sure the soil is reasonably moist. You don't want it to be bone dry, just kicking up dust and hard to cut through, but not super wet. For turf removal, you're going to want to, oftentimes they'll have adjustable settings. You want to set the cut to be as deep as possible. Might be a couple of inches. That depth, though, is still usually only super effective for removing cool season turf. If you have all that tall fescue, that'll be enough. It's not going to come back from the roots. But with what we've talked about with Bermuda, those deep, deep roots, you'll get rid of the main thatch, the main growing area, the main growing point with the sod cut. But there's going to be enough roots deeper down that after a couple of weeks, couple of months, there's going to be a lot growing back. So oftentimes when people do this, they're still topping it up with like a paper or a cardboard weed barrier. And so if you really want to get down through all that thatch, you could do that. It's a little bit of a shortcut. Like if you use a sod cutter, you can definitely plant and sheet mulch right away, kind of skip that 8-week period because it will be knocked back some. But if you don't still use some sort of barrier, it's still going to be coming back from the deeper roots. Enough of it that you'll have to do something about it. If you are going to be renting a sod cutter, normally it's about $150 a day for a rental, at least locally here in Southern California. And you're going to be having to pay to dispose of it, usually by renting what's called a lowboy dumpster, which we'll see on the next slide. And part of that you're paying by weight. And so allowing it to dry out before it's disposed of after the sod is cut can greatly help reduce the weight. So soil is very heavy, needs to be disposed of in a special way. Normally that's by renting a lowboy dumpster, and you'll specifically tell them it's going to be for like sod removal, and they'll kind of know how to charge you along with that, because that will generally still be cheaper than like what they would charge you for if you were like breaking up a patio and removing concrete. But the costs can add up really quickly. So you'll need to rent one or more 10-yard dumpsters. They have a capacity of 10 cubic yards of material, roughly, but can hold up to 10 tons. So for an example, for one dumpster, I wanted to price this out putting together this presentation. So I called one of the local typical companies that would do this. $441 for a 7-day rental for the dumpster. And if you have them pick it up earlier, you're not really going to be saving money. So that includes drop off and pickup, plus $78 per ton disposal fee. So I did some calculations using a sod cutter to remove the top 2.5 inches of soil from a 1,000 square foot lawn. So medium size for a typical suburban lawn, small if it's older construction front lawn, pretty generous if it's brand new construction, but for 1,000 square feet, so not huge, that'll weigh approximately 8.5 tons. Which someone will need to actually load into the lowboy. So that's a lot of weight to move if you're doing it with a wheelbarrow. And then once you add up the rental plus the disposal fee, that's about $1,100. So significant costs in addition to significant labor. Versus if you just sheet mulch on top of it and kind of wait that 8 weeks or solarize and then sheet mulch, all of that thatch will eventually just kind of compost in place and break down. So yes, you'll have a little bit more Bermuda grass regrowth, but either way, you're going to have that regrowth. And so I'd rather skip this whole thing, skip the environmental impact of having the diesel truck drop off the lowboy dumpster, picking it back up, putting the soil connected to the sod, which is normally perfectly good soil, into the landfill, all the trucking involved with that. I normally skip it, but it comes up a lot in questions. Some people do recommend it. Sometimes contractors use it. So I just kind of wanted to include it. If you're hiring a contractor to do your turf removal and they are doing that plus something else to help control the turf, it's not the end of the world. But for a DIY kind of project, this is not a step that I think is necessary, nor do I do it myself. If you're working with a contractor and it's a large yard, Sometimes they will want to use what's called a bobcat, which is the small tractor with the arms generally connected like in the mid part or the back to just basically scrape up the sod. If it's a certain scale of a project, it kind of becomes the only practical, economical way to hire someone to do it. And so, and I've been involved in plenty of commercial scale projects where this is just how it has been done. Not ideal for a home landscape though, and I would skip that part if I could. The reason why is because even though this is a relatively small piece of heavy equipment, it actually causes a lot of soil compaction. And especially if you live in like not a brand new development and the area has been in sod for a long time, generally with all the years of the roots dying and regrowing and dying and regrowing and just the natural processes, generally the soil is actually in decent shape underneath that, as long as it hasn't been like blasted with too much high potency fertilizer or pesticides. And as soon as you get this piece of equipment onto that soil, you get a lot of compaction. I've actually, kind of gone through the whole ringer about this on construction sites, and at one point in time in a large project was able to, in order to justify the fact that I wasn't going to allow bobcats to get back on the soil after it had been prepared, to like do other things related to utilities. We had a geotechnical engineer who normally tests soil compaction to make sure that building footings are compacted enough, do some compaction tests on garden soil, and then after a bobcat has gone over it a few times, and so I've quantified the compaction, even with just a little bit of work, is significant. So if you're thinking about this and there's a way to avoid it, avoid it. If there is a bobcat used, make sure that the contractor has a plan to loosen the soil, sometimes using another piece of equipment called the mini excavator, which can kind of loosen and work its way out afterwards to relieve that compaction. So a question coming in from Amy. Is it worth using a sod cutter on scalp Bermuda as step one? I could do without disposal fees. I'd follow with solarization, then cardboard. What do you think? I would totally skip it. If you're going to be doing all of that, I would, cut down that Bermuda as tightly as you can with a string trimmer. That's probably what you mean by scalped, and then do the solarization and then the cardboard. I absolutely wouldn't do it. And again, those Bermuda roots can be 8-10 inches down. So the sod cutter is not going to get that deep. I just absolutely wouldn't even bother. Okay, and now moving into the last method that we are going to talk about. And it's not a method that I recommend anymore. It's a method that I have used. And so when I talk about the advantages and disadvantages, you are not just hearing from someone who is just would never consider using herbicide because I have an ideological, like organic techniques only. I really try to stick to it, and in most cases I do. But like I mentioned earlier, because I had projects where it was just not working, I tried it to see what would happen and have used it on a number of projects. And these days, don't do it again. It's just not worth it because it's not more effective than other techniques. That's ultimately what it comes down to. The reason why I'm going to talk about it is because even after saying that, some people will come up to me and say, yeah, but I'm still going to use it. That's just what I'm going to do. And so I think it's important to provide the information. Also, if any person in Southern California goes into a hardware store or a landscape supply store and says, I have Bermuda grass, what should I do? They're going to give you this stuff. It might be called Roundup, or it might go by a number of other names because of the patent has expired on the glyphosate, which is the active element. So there's a number of trade names it's sold under. But essentially, the stuff most commonly used for removing grass is glyphosate, which is Roundup. There have been many lawsuits against the manufacturer over cancer, specifically lymphoma, by people who have used it long term. It's one of those things where there's highly paid lawyers on both sides still arguing about the relevance of the science. Many international organizations consider it carcinogenic. It's possible carcinogenic, I think, in the US, and there's billions of dollars involved. So it's really hard to get to the bottom of it. Both sides have scientists doing studies for them. But here's one for me, kind of the issue was settled, is because there have been so many claims that have gone to trial, which are overseen by juries and then have awarded people after going over all of the evidence and listening to all the expert testimony, with settlements that the manufacturer, Bayer, has proposed over $10 billion. That's what they are proposing as a way to create a fund to pay out on all the current lawsuits, as a way to try to limit costs because they are worried that they will need to pay more. So that's kind of tells you something about this product. If you still decide to use herbicide, do your research, wear proper personal protective equipment. Minimally, that is going to be boots, long sleeves, gloves, eye protection. Do not spray when it is breezy or windy for multiple reasons. The first one is you don't want to breathe it in more than you need to or get it in your eyes. The second one is this stuff can really go on the wind, and some plants are extremely sensitive to it, including roses. If you spray it on your lawn when it's breezy or windy and it blows onto your neighbor's roses, they will either die very quickly or do very poorly for many years, and they will be very unhappy with you. Know that Bermuda grass may still come back. So, in addition to the health concerns, which for me would be enough to no longer teach that you should really consider this as a top technique, I've just had examples of projects where I have used this stuff by the book, mixed it to the exact right amount, specifically the concentration recommended for Bermuda grass. The best practices are, it's never something that for Bermuda grass you're going to spray once and be done. So the best practices are considered to be, in terms of thoroughly killing the grass, to be spraying the grass, no moisture touches it for 48 hours so it can absorb in, irrigating as if it was a normal turf schedule in between, 2 weeks later spraying what's still green and alive, same process, irrigating in between because you want to know whether or not it's truly dead or if it is just going dormant. So if there's no moisture, it might just go dormant, and then the weed killer wouldn't work. And doing that 4 times or so, however long it takes. So I've done that before. 8-week process, just as long as if I had sheet mulched and then just kind of waited for things to be smothered underneath, or just as long as it would take for solarization to really kick in. Gone forward, and then the next spring, there's still plenty of Bermuda grass coming back. So if that's going to be the case, and if none of these things are perfect, I might as well not use the one that is a carcinogenic thing that can cause other environmental issues and potentially kill my neighbor's roses. In addition, it doesn't work well on things with glossy leaves, so nutsedge, it's just not effective on. So that essentially is where currently I come down on considering herbicides. It's, for health concerns, there's plenty of reasons not to use it, but it's really not more effective than the other techniques. So you might as well go with the more environmentally friendly one. And so from there, we're going to shift to a little bit about what to expect next. So this is my front yard landscape when it was planted young. This is a couple of months in. We'll kind of go a little bit farther back and show some additional pictures a little bit later. And so you can see this was cardboard mulched. And so you can see mostly looking pretty good. Young garden, pretty typical, where it's going to look like a lot of mulch in between. Some people think, oh, it's never going to grow in. I should have planted more. If you research your plants, how big they're going to get, have faith, they'll grow in, usually start growing in pretty quickly. That was totally the case here. And here's what you start to see. little bit of Bermuda grass coming up and starting to spread. Sometimes it's amazing. Sometimes you'll catch it smaller, but oftentimes you won't notice it until there's a certain amount of green. Get out there, dig it out right away, prevent it from spreading. Really, you never want to let it get into the root areas of your new young plants, because once that's all mixed up, it's really hard to deal with. And then you don't want to be digging down into the roots of your new plants. So get it out as soon as you can. Here, when you see this is a little bit of nutsedge coming back up. All very typical. So you can see here, this is what starts to be happening. Here you can see my asphalt driveway. This isn't all Bermuda grass, but some weeds. And then definitely at the corners, one of the spots, a little bit of Bermuda grass coming back in. And so first year, I mean, it's going to depend on your site. Every site's going to be a little bit different, but no matter what technique you're going to use, my actual recommendation is be prepared, honestly, first year, first warm season after putting in your new landscape. Once a week on the weekends, walk through, do weed patrol, or if you have a gardener that's still working for you, or maybe you're no longer have your mow and blow gardener, but if you're not going to be doing the weeding themselves, talk to them. Oftentimes the mow and blow gardener who does the neighborhood will be happy to do kind of more custom services like walk through here and pull the weeds once a week while this is getting established. Might be just fine. So you can talk with them about that and ask them for a price on that, or do it yourself. But the important thing is it has to be done, and anticipate once a week, walking through and immediately pulling out whatever you can. This is my absolute number one favorite tool for weeding, especially for Bermuda grass in mulched landscapes, dandelions, pretty much anything. It's called a hori-hori, sometimes called the garden knife. It's a traditional Japanese tool used for many things in the garden. Be sure to get one. They come in some different designs. Be sure to get one where one side is serrated. You can kind of see here that it's that serrated jagged edge, and one side is smooth. The serrated side is the important, but you pretty much never see them with two serrated sides. This is kind of standard. They sell them in stainless steel and a black carbon steel. The black carbon steel ones are a little bit cheaper, but they can rust. Again, this is something that's going to be in soil and moisture. You want to dry it off when you're done, but if you get the stainless steel one and you treat it well, it'll last you forever. Expect to pay $20 to $30 for a decent one, maybe up to $35. There's a number of brands that are sold online that look pretty much exactly like this. Those are mostly pretty good. If it's super cheap, be skeptical. There's some American garden tool brands have started making their versions of it. Most of the ones that I've seen are not built well. The Japanese ones tend to have the best combination of price and quality, and you can get them online at a number of places, all the places you expect. And so that's a hori-hori. And that's just really good for, you can kind of stick it or wiggle it right down into the soil. And so without digging a big hole, you can normally get like at least 6 inches of Bermuda grass roots out. There might not be 6 inches of roots to pull. And then often what you can do for Bermuda grass in that mulched landscape is near the base of where it's coming out, you can kind of stick it in and wiggle and lift some. And then with a gloved hand, you kind of grab and slowly pull it up and try to kind of pull along with it any of the roots you can that are spreading out in any direction. You won't get it all, but it's just kind of consistency of doing as much as you can. And what happens is that over time, it will start to be less. So the first warm season, expect once per week, and then you can be pleasantly surprised if it's less. Second warm season, plan on every other week, might be less. And then by the time you're in your third warm season, that's where I am with my front yard now. About once a month, maybe in the height of summer every 2 weeks, but about once a month. And once you get to that, like every 3 weeks, once a month, if it's like my neighborhood, just from the lawns that are around, there's still going to be a little Bermuda grass creeping in. I'll never really know, is it remnant from the original planting or some new seed that's blown in? What I know is that I need to get out there every 3 weeks to a month, make sure it doesn't get out of control. But that's about the right timing for just other weeds that might be coming up, dandelions or other things like that. The more my plants grow in, and based on my planting design, I encourage you to have a decent amount of plant density with trees, shrubs, ground covers, and not just big expanses of mulch, because something's going to grow in that. It might as well be the plants you want to be growing there. And the more that grows in, the more the soil is shaded, also the less there is. And so getting out to do some a little bit of weeding every 3 weeks to a month is about right anyways. And just prioritize. If you see the Bermuda grass or that nutsedge, make sure you get that out first, whether it's you or if you're having a gardener continue to visit. Don't let it get out of control. Once it gets into the center of your plants, it's a pain to deal with. And occasionally that happens. I have some bunch grasses where I just know I need to kind of get in there and check because it kind of blends in and pull it out. But overall, the casual observer wouldn't know that it's in there. So that's just the reality of gardening. There's not such thing as a no maintenance garden. We try to keep it beautiful, highly productive, great habitat, and lots of fun to be in, but low maintenance. And then one of the other advantages just of this that I didn't even mention at the beginning of the class, but I was thinking about coming back from our break as I was closing windows because I'm working from home today, because I'm hearing the course of Saturday morning string trimmers and lawnmowers being pushed around the neighborhood. And when you do need to go out to do your weeding, you can do it with a cup of coffee in the morning, a beer in the evening, and spend some time around beautiful gardens. My front yard is a California native garden with amazing smelling plants. And it's like, yes, it's some maintenance, but it's so much more enjoyable than needing to walk behind a noisy and potentially, stinky gas-powered lawnmower. Just, the maintenance is so much less painful. So, other things you should be thinking about right now. If you are in Southern California, there are turf replacement rebates available. So if you're starting with turf, can be brown, that thatch has to be there. That's the thing. They don't want you to water it a bunch to green it up. You'll see in a few moments what my front yard looked like when I got started on it. Can be pretty brown. You might want to water it to see what's dormant and what's not, but doesn't need to be a beautiful lawn. There are existing programs, main one called the Turf Replacement Program, that could help you out. Most of them it pays basically per square foot of turf removed to put in a water-wise garden that also meets other requirements for an irrigation system, or you can totally abandon the irrigation system, and then requirements to capture some amount of water when it rains through something like a dry stream bed. I go through that in detail in the Landscape Transformation Basics class I teach one Thursday each month from 6 to 8:30 p.m. I happen to be teaching it this upcoming Thursday evening from 6 to 8:30. You can register on Eventbrite, just like you registered for this program, or you can check out the YouTube recording after on our YouTube page right now. There is a past recording of that as well if you don't want to wait. A bit of the content will repeat with some overlap in this workshop, but there's mostly new information. We talk about the rebates. We talk a lot about the design process, just a little bit about turf removal, and then just a little bit about irrigation with some mentions of other workshops as well. And actually, I do need to update. This is an old link in here. If you do want to get the link to where all of our workshops are, I'm typing that into the chat right now. cbwcd.org/waterwise workshops will bring you right to the redirect to our Eventbrite page where you can see all of our upcoming workshops. And then a few notes about construction planning. So starting to think about what are the other things, if you're thinking about the turf removal project, to be considering. Make sure you consider your construction planning, especially in regards to phasing when you take on your turf replacement. If you're going to be doing a big project, whole front yard, whole backyard, both, can you really take it on all at once, whether it's your own labor or budgeting? Are you going to take it on in phases, a bit at a time on the weekends when you find the time here and there? That's how I take on my projects. Plan to plant in that best season if you can, mid to late fall, thinking like right before Thanksgiving through New Year's in Southern California is perfect. Summer is a great time for contemplating design, killing turf, preparing your irrigation, all of that. Work with your budget and adjust your design as necessary. And if you're working with a contractor, start talking to contractors super early, finding out about costs. You always want to get quotes from multiple contractors, ask for and check references, And good contractors normally can't start the next week on your project. They're often booked up for a couple of months, maybe even more. So if you are thinking about it now, kind of figure out your design, start talking to contractors and get on their schedule so that they can do everything the right time of year, because contractors can't always do everything at the right time of year for all of their clients. That just doesn't work for any feasible business model if you're hiring a professional. So try to get lined up so that your project can hit all of those milestones correctly. So see some questions coming in. Let's answer some questions before we move on. From Diane, I have cape weed taking over my yard, tried everything, digging it up, solarizing it, using 15% vinegar. Had to eventually use glyphosate, applied for 3 years after solarizing, only where it sprung up, finally gone. Have heard Roundup is out of your soil 3 years after use, very bummed, nothing else worked. Yeah, so I don't want anyone who's used Roundup in the past to feel bad. I've used Roundup in the past. I just don't recommend it. And so like you had an extreme situation. I just don't recommend it as like one of the go-tos for turf replacement anymore. If it is going to be used, here's how I think about it. And in your case, it kind of lines up. I think of Roundup kind of like how people think about these days, like taking antibiotics, how like taking antibiotics can be really bad for like all the beneficial bacteria and stuff in your gut. And then people start thinking about like probiotics after they've been on it. And there's all sorts of research going on to try to get everything back in balance. But if you have a bacterial issue that's really going to be threatening to you, you take the antibiotics and then you deal with it afterwards. That's kind of how I think about glyphosate. Like you tried everything, that's eventually what you slowly used and for a very specific reason, and it got you over that hump. Now you can go back to everything else. Generally, the glyphosate in a healthy soil system, which is one that hasn't been beaten down by year after year after year of pesticide use and too much inorganic fertilizer, the bacteria in the soil ecosystem will break down the components of the glyphosate. And again, that's why I would never recommend glyphosate as ongoing maintenance. I vehemently don't agree as something that should be used just to take care of weeds here and there ongoing. But to deal with a specific issue, if that was the only way glyphosate was used when the other kind of more organic things aren't working, then we'd be living in a very different situation with our kind of collective herbicide use. From Daniel, I have Bermuda in the root ball of a rose bush. Is there anything that could kill the rhizome without harming the rose bush? That's really tough. I mean, if it was me, I would just keep pulling it and I would do a couple layers of like the paper mulch where I can, and then just pull it at the base when it comes back. I would absolutely not spray. Sometimes people will with thick rubber gloves, put a little bit of glyphosate like on a sponge and apply it directly. But roses are particularly super sensitive to glyphosate or Roundup. So I probably would avoid it and just keep pulling it. From Yoav, I'm not a fan of Roundup either, but due to years of drought and lawn neglect, I have a number of aggressive flowering weeds in addition to Bermuda, more like a vacant lot. Worried about sheet mulching or other techniques being effective. So I'm not telling you what to do because every specific site is different. Things can be different. What I will tell you is that most of the aggressive flowering weeds are surprisingly easy to bring into effective control using sheet mulching, because they just, once they're smothered, they're going to be smothered, and they're going to die pretty quickly. Where the problem with the Bermuda grass is that it can creep. That's really, and it can come up from any bit of rhizome, and it's often has those roots that can creep back underneath the sidewalks and the concrete. So in my experience, flowering weeds, cheeseweed, sow thistles, dandelions, all that sort of stuff, oxalis, I always go to the sheet mulching, and I'm always pretty happy with results. From And do I typically work around the existing irrigation system, even if it's wonky and DIY? Is it worth spending the money to do it over maybe with a landscaper? If you're going to be, here's how I think about it. If you are going to be doing this to now put in an entirely new garden, spending the time, effort, and money to do that, absolutely. Don't neglect the irrigation system. That's going to help protect your investment. A turf irrigation system, which will pop up 2 to 4 inches, is also not going to work for a new, more diverse garden of different heights of plants. There are different approaches you can take. Going to a drip system or a spray system on taller risers that's highly efficient, different nozzles. And that workshop, we have all about it on our YouTube page, is the retrofitting turf irrigation systems for waterwise and native gardens, is really the part to look at. There is the workshop to look at. And that can also help you decide if maybe it's a project you would want to take on, or if it's something you would want to hire a landscaper to do. There's some supplemental videos on the YouTube channel that kind of follow step by step. Okay, if you're going to do the drip, how would you do it? If you're going to do the spray, how would you do it? A lot of information. So that can prepare you to think, yes, I think I can take it on myself, or no, I have to hire someone to do it. But don't neglect the irrigation system, even if it means you need to budget for a little bit longer before you take on your project. That's generally going to be worth it, because you don't want to have a half-functioning turf irrigation system trying to water a new waterwise garden. Okay, we are at 11:45. I'm going to jump back into it. We are getting towards the end. Anyways, wrapping up, but I want to make sure that I include all this stuff to pull it together, and then I'll have plenty of time for questions at the end if there are any more. So for those of you starting to think, okay, now what am I going to be thinking about for planting or design? We have a lot of resources to help you with that for people in Southern California. Number one, I'd recommend you go to, and in the Landscape Transformation Basic class, we hop on this website and do a quick demo, is the Inland Valley Garden Planner, developed for our local area, Inland Empire conditions, but the climate, soils, etc., are very similar, like Riverside through the area where we are, through the San Gabriel, through the San Fernando Valley. And most of the information really applies everyone kind of city out to the coast in Southern California as well. People can just get away with watering less, and some of the plants can be in a little bit more sun. So should be a good resource for a lot of people on the workshop. That's inlandvalleygardenplanner.org. Detailed plant profiles, including like where they work well, irrigation and maintenance information as well. So you or your gardener can know how to maintain these waterwise plants after they're in. For our top 350 plants for Southern California home gardens, most of what you might be able to find in a local nursery, about 120 something of them are California native plants. So not everything you'd find if you go to a specialty native nursery, but all of our favorites for home gardeners who are maybe getting into natives for the first time. inlandvalleygardenplanner.org. YouTube recordings of all our past workshops, going a lot into design. Also have, after you look at design and you're thinking more about plants, a favorite plants for Inland Valley Gardens workshop that's just kind of plant by plant, some of my favorites for home gardens and why, in different situations. What are the plants that are great in full blasting sun? What are the plants that are great for that tricky area on the north side of the house or garage that's shady a lot of the year and then really sunny in the middle of the summer? And again, the vast majority of those plants will also work in more moderate areas farther away from the inland. So we have those in the YouTube recordings of the past workshops. And then for those of you in our local area where we're able to serve you based on our funding on our kind of more in-depth one-on-one programs. So if you get your water from Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley Water District, Monte Vista Water District, Ontario, Fontana, or Upland, we actually have a one-on-one residential landscape design assistance program where you start with choosing a theme, which comes with a basic plant list that then we can add on to for your specific site of different garden styles, which is on the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. And then we will literally work with you and create a planting design for either your front yard or your backyard. It's a no-cost program. It does have a $100 refundable deposit. which if you put in a water-wise garden in the area within a year after you get your designs, you get a full rebate. And we work with you. You send us measurements and photos, and then we have an over Zoom screen sharing meeting, and we sit down and we design your yard. So there's a lot more details to it, give you a more accurate picture of what you'd be in for. And that's at cbwcd.org/design assistance, gives you all of that information. Here's just an example of a pollinator and butterfly friendly, mostly California native front yard garden that we designed for a participant in the program. And the biggest thing overall, hop on the Inland Valley Garden Planner after either doing our landscape transformation basics, ideally also checking out our design online workshop. If you're going to be doing this, some of those workshops aren't super short. The design workshops are 3 hours, just like this, but they will help you so much in protecting your investment and creating something that you are going to be truly happy with. You're going to be spending a decent amount of money on this, decent amount of time on this, even if you're hiring a professional. So do that research. I've tried really hard to make it easy for you and also hopefully fun and inspiring as you look at it. But I've mentioned this in most of my workshops, including this one. As you're thinking about it, do the research, use the websites, match your plants to your soil and site conditions. So that's going to be your sun and shade, your soil drainage, which we don't have time to get into now, but basically, do you have clay soil or slowly draining soil? If so, plant plants that are adapted to clay soil, which there's a search function on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, and you can click plants adapted to clay soil, and all the plants it brings back for you to look at will be ones that can take that slower draining soil. And size. People very often underestimate how big the plants are going to get, how quickly, and put way too many plants into their landscape. And that, as they start getting overgrown, makes it not look great and hard to maintain. Space appropriately, and you'll get the look you're going for, and it will stay much lower maintenance. So, quick question that came in from Sarah. Does the Inland Valley Garden Planner indicate which succulents are winter or summer dormant? So some succulents, just for context, really don't want summer water. If you're talking about true succulents, I don't think you're talking about native plants. If you are talking about native plants, let me know. But succulent and cacti are from areas where they really don't want summer water. Summer water can be very bad for them. All of the succulents we have on the Inland Valley Garden Planner are ones that are pretty easy to grow, are going to look pretty decent year round. If they have a little bit of a down season, it'll generally mention it. We don't have any of those like rare plants that are super fussy to maintain. Just follow the basic guidelines for each of the plants and you'll be fine. We intentionally, because we're developing this for like the average home gardener who's not trying to be a horticultural enthusiast, but just wants a nice landscape that's going to do more than their lawn used to do for them, and they can be successful in keeping it up. We don't have anything with weird, like you absolutely can't water this succulent in the summer kind of requirements. Okay, so to kind of wrap it all up in our last few minutes, just kind of want to show you the run through of the process of removing the turf and putting in my front yard. Some of the other classes that go into design use this yard, our native design class, for example, and show more pictures and more recent pictures as it grows in more as we talk about design. But here we're just kind of talking about the process and what to expect. So this is my front yard right when we moved into the place. Patchy, pretty much all Bermuda grass and weeds. You can see some dandelions here. Close up. This is January when we were getting started. So you can see, and this was okay for the turf replacement rebate. You can see it's not green, but it's really all here. I didn't stick to that ideal project schedule that I recommended you all to. My partner and I are both professional horticulture people, and we got in and I was like, I'm just going to kind of push it. We might plant spring at the latest possible time before it gets hot, but I was willing to accept if some plants died to replace them because I wasn't going to be doing my job and watering a lawn that I wasn't going to be using for a whole big chunk of a year to get through to the other time of year where it might be a little bit better, and I wasn't going to be the new neighbor whose landscape looked like this for a whole year. So January, that's it. We're going to be using sheet mulching. March, here we go, plant layout day. Finally got around to it. Had a bunch of work to do inside the house as well. So it took a while. And this, most of the green here is the cool season POA annual grass. And we knew that with sheet mulching, we'd be able to really take care of it. So you can see here is our plant density. More of a meadow area, so smaller plants closer together in the front. And this is actually a pretty high plant density. Yours might be less, but this was about right for our design. Here, there's a trench here, part of our water harvesting plan, which we talk about in the Landscape Transformation Basics class, using this as an example. Getting started planting. And here it is, March 14th, plants in the ground. Most people look at it now and think, oh my God, this is never going to grow. Should have got way more plants, should have bought them way bigger. They'll start growing. I pretty much almost always only buy 1 gallon small plants, unless there's a plant that I can only get in a larger size. And usually the largest I'll go is a 5 gallon plant. Don't need to buy big plants. And so here you can see our cardboard and our mulch pile. For a yard this size, in the front, you don't need a mulch pile this big. This was also the mulch for our quite large backyard because we have a weird wedge-shaped lot. So it's narrow in the front and it gets wider and wider and wider and wider in the back. So here you can see, we just had a whole mix of boxes from kitchen cabinets, pet food deliveries, all sorts of things, working with as much overlap as possible. And you can see, you know, this was what was going to work for us on our time schedule. Not the perfectly idealized situation that I talked about in terms of time of year, large box sizes, planting, you know, leaving it under sheet mulch for a certain amount of time. Made the decision to go ahead, informed by all the best practices, but this is just what I was going to do. So if, you know, we all end up making our own decisions. I present, you know, completely best practices because that's the ideal and will make the least long-term work. So I had some weed regrowth and I've been dealing with it. But overall, very successful project. And so here it's about 2 months, plants starting to grow, getting a little bit of color. You can see here some other angles. Starting to grow in a little bit more. Still can't really see the design intent. Some of the larger, more long-term plants start growing slower, and some of the more herbaceous, fast-growing plants come in quicker. But in August, happened to be looking out the window or looking out the screen door on a warm day, and not a lot of mulch left, mostly plants. So all of a sudden, it's a garden in the front where it was higher plant density. On the outside, still a decent amount of mulch, but coming along. Some color coming in from California fuchsia. You can see native habitat in action, native leafcutter bees starting to use our western redbud tree. That's a good thing. They're not going to harm the tree, using this to make their nests. You can see part of our capturing the rainwater, putting it to good use, coming off the roof. Got the yard certified as a wildlife habitat with food, water, cover, places to raise young, and the birds really have moved in. It's constantly songbirds and butterflies in the yard. Any project, you'll lose a few plants. So here's a red buckwheat that we lost a couple. The vast majority of the plants lived, but don't beat up on yourself if you lose a couple of plants in the process. And around 6 months, you know, still a lot of growing to do. Eventually this will be, you know, this manzanita here will be like that tall, but manzanita grows kind of slowly. So we gave it plenty of space around it, but, you know, starting to be a lovely little garden. And coming along. So did the design, did the sheet mulching, had things grow. And then, you know, that first year we were just doing that weekly weed patrol, pulling things out. Second year, every other week. And now every month, every 3 weeks, just keep an eye on things, do some light maintenance. And it's a pleasure to be out in the garden. So pretty much to conclude, get a lot of questions about this. So this is our last slide before we can answer any remaining questions. The order of things. Turf replacement or turf removal actually comes a little bit farther in than sometimes people will think. Great thing to be thinking about now, but here's my recommended order of things. Before you even start thinking about plants, think about what are your goals for the project. And we talk about this in the landscape transformation basics class, setting your goals. You're going to go through a process of making site observations, thinking about your budget, coming up with a design. If you're working with contractors, you're going to talk to multiple contractors, get multiple quotes, and check references. If you're applying for the turf replacement rebate, you can do that application because you need to get your approval, which takes a week or two to get the approval back before you can start killing your turf. They actually come out and spot check. And if you've already ripped out your turf or really getting going, you can lose your eligibility for the rebate. So you need to get that application in, which requires a design. They make you think about it first and then apply. The design can be very, very simple, rough, hand-drawn. It doesn't have to have every single plant. Don't be intimidated by that. It just needs to show that you have some intention of what you're going to be doing. Then you'll kill your turf, prepare the site. If you're moving soil, dig in dry stream beds, doing anything like that, you can do all that. Ideal, if you can work with the schedule, this should be done in summer for the warm season grass, killing the turf for that Bermuda grass. Best to kill it in the summer. Primary irrigation system work. If you're doing the sheet mulching, definitely get that done before you do that. So depending on your technique, can go either way there. Planting, best done late fall, early winter. Have the irrigation system done as much as possible before then. Sometimes for people who are like running drip irrigation, they'll do all of the main pipes, but then they'll plant and then run those final emitter lines after the plants go in. Then you're going to be doing your final mulching, or if you've done sheet mulching, then you're just doing your cleanup and your final touches. And then you're moving into your first week of, or your first year of establishment care and watching your garden grow in, doing your weekly patrol for any weeds or whatever's growing back, which is also really good in your first year, just to be checking in with your plants, make sure everything looks like it's growing in well and it's on its way. So with that, we all have plenty of time for questions, but I also want to, before any of you who have to take off immediately, launch a very quick closing poll, which lets us know how we are doing in presenting this information. And in addition to the poll, I love getting comments in the chat. If there is anything in this presentation you thought was particularly useful, or that you know that you will be putting to use, I'd love to hear about that in the chat. Or if there's anything that wasn't clear or you were hoping would be included, please let me know as well, or any other comments in general. And so while people are doing that, I will start on any remaining questions. So feel free to type in questions as well. Okay, from Diane. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area nearer to the Sonoma coast. Lovely area. Is there any place I could recommend in that area that provides this kind of service? If you let me know specifically what you are looking at, I didn't quite track when that came in terms of this type of service. I can try to let you know. If it's the design program, I don't specifically think so. Up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I think they're even, I think they might be based out of Santa Rosa. There's a nonprofit called Daily Acts, Daily ACTS Acts. And they are very involved in a bunch of environmental things, but a lot of work around like community-based landscape transformation, moving towards putting in native gardens and things like that. I don't know about all their services, but certainly probably resources, and they can probably connect you with other local resources. There's a pretty active local area supporting projects like this. I just don't know specifically up there. And then also you might check in with, in the Bay Area, there's a lot of active local chapters of the California Native Plant Society. And so there probably are definitely like local experts in your area who, if not providing a whole design, you can sometimes go to meetings and get really good advice. Okay, cool. Well, any other questions? Let me know. Oh, from Diane. Sorry, I live in near Santa Rosa. Daily acts act like things you do. ACTS. Daily acts. And I think they actually did, if I'm remembering right, they led a big volunteer project to rip out the turf and put in a low water landscape at the Santa Rosa City Hall, if I'm remembering the right one, kind of using a lot of these ecological techniques. So someone had mentioned that it'd be great to get a nice step-by-step list of cardboard and mulch steps, how thick of mulch, watering, timeline, etc. That is a great suggestion, and I will take that suggestion and try to put that together into a guide. I don't know what the timeline for that will be, but that's something we can definitely eventually create. And in terms of how thick of mulch, that's something that I think everything else, if you listen back through the recording, you'll get all of the other stuff. But how thick of mulch would generally be for wood chip mulch, about 2 to 3 inches. If you're doing something like fruit trees that wants kind of more organic soil than like our native plants, about 4 inches is perfect for fruit trees of the wood chip mulch. If you're doing like a gravel or decomposed granite mulch, about 2 inches. So hopefully that will help. But thank you for that recommendation. That would be a good supplement for this workshop. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much for joining us. Please sign up for our newsletter to get all of our other upcoming announcements. Also, on our Inland Valley Garden Planner website, we're working on a huge project that's going to bring a lot of design resources and kind of ideas about how to design your own landscape around some specific garden styles. So you'll find out about that on the newsletter when all of that launches later this year, and check out our other resources. And with that, I will say have a good rest of your weekend. Thanks for joining us. And I will hang out as people leave just in case any other questions come in to the question and answer. Thanks, everybody.